The first thing I remember is the sound, an empty, hollow, quiet, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my tires as I turned off the state highway and onto a road that didn't appear on my GPS. That wasn't unusual in the rural Midwest. Out there, county roads looped and twisted, changed names, disappeared altogether. I'd been driving cross country, taking back roads whenever I could. After everything that happened that year, my divorce, losing my dad, nearly losing my house, I needed to be somewhere nobody knew me. I needed flat horizon lines and long stretches of absolutely nothing. The sun hung low over Kansas fields when I passed a bent road sign that simply read, Morrow Ridge, 7 miles. The arrow pointed toward a narrow strip of cracked pavement vanishing into miles of prairie. My GPS recalculated, then froze, then gave a cheerful little beep as the screen went blank. I should have turned back, but I didn't. The road cut through fields of pale grass that swayed like something alive. Every few hundred yards, the land dipped slightly and rose again, giving me the eerie sense someone or something was moving in the grass alongside me, matching my speed, just out of sight. By the time I reached the ridge, little more than a shallow rise in the land, the sun had nearly set. Ahead, I saw a scatter of buildings huddled together near the road. A rust-red grain elevator, a small church with a missing steeple, maybe a dozen houses in various states of decay. A sign leaning sideways read, Welcome to Morrow Ridge, Pop, 42. But the painted numbers had been crossed out in thick black strokes. Underneath, someone had carved the number 0 with what looked like a knife. I slowed the car, but didn't stop. I wasn't planning to stay, just pass through, maybe snap a photo of the abandoned elevator, then keep heading west until I found a motel that didn't smell like mildew. That was the plan. But there was a figure standing in the road. A tall man, thin, wearing overalls and a dirty flannel shirt. He didn't wave, didn't step aside, just stood dead center, staring at me with the stillness of a statue. I braked hard, gravel popping beneath my tires. He didn't move. I lowered my window an inch. You need something? I called. No response. Not even a blink. Sir, are you all right? Slowly, with a kind of painful stiffness, he lifted one arm. Not to wave, but to point behind me, back toward the road I had come from. Road's closed, he finally rasped. Turn around. There's no sign saying that, I said. Closed, he said again, louder. Turn, around. Something in his voice made my stomach knot. Not fear, exactly, more like the feeling of being somewhere I didn't belong. I started to reverse, but before I'd gone a full car length, another figure walked out from behind the grain elevator, then another from between two houses, and another from beside the church, all of them stopping in place, all of them staring at my car, all of them pointing behind me. I didn't argue. I turned the wheel hard, did a sloppy 3-point turn, and floored it back down the cracked pavement. But after less than a mile, the road ended. Not faded out, not turned to gravel, just ended. A clean break, pavement stopping like someone had cut it with a giant saw. Beyond that was nothing but open dirt and tall grass. I stopped, stared, looked down at my GPS again, still blank. There had been a road here. I had just driven it. I checked my rearview mirror. The people were gone. The whole damn town was gone. Where Morrow Ridge had been, a cluster of buildings crouched at the rise, there was now just prairie. Unbroken grass, no grain elevator, no church, nothing. I sat there in my car, engine idling, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth, trying to comprehend what I was seeing or not seeing. I opened my door, stepped out, took several photos with my phone. Nothing. Just fields and sky. I got back into the car, hands shaking, and kept driving forward along the dirt path until it grew too rough, then gave up and turned around again. Except when I turned, the town was back. Just there. Like it had never vanished. The instant I faced it, bam, buildings, houses, grain elevator, church, and people standing silently in the road. All of them pointing at me. My hands went numb on the steering wheel. I think part of me blacked out for a moment, not unconscious, just unable to process anything beyond pure fight-or-flight instinct. So I drove toward them. I don't know why. Maybe because going backward hadn't worked. Maybe because going forward was the only direction that existed anymore. When I reached the edge of the town, the pointing stopped. The people lowered their arms and stepped aside, clearing a narrow path. A woman with gray hair nearly down to her waist whispered as I passed, "You shouldn't have come back." I didn't come back, I shouted through the window. The road, your whole town, disappeared. I couldn't. Her eyes met mine, and every word in my throat suddenly felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to tell her, or tell anyone. "Go to the inn," she said, "before it gets dark." "What inn?" She pointed toward a squat, two-story building with a faded veranda. It looked abandoned like everything else. The porch roof sagged visibly. The windows were smeared with dust. "I'm not staying here," I said immediately. But the woman was already turning away. I drove slowly toward the inn, glancing into each alley, each yard. Most of the houses were boarded up from the inside. Some had heavy chains wrapped around the doors. One had a spray-painted message across the front in huge red letters, "Stay inside after dark." At the far end of the street, swaying in the wind, a long rope hung from a tree. Frayed, torn, old, a noose. I swallowed hard. Inside the inn's gravel lot, I parked and tried my phone again. No signal. Not even one bar. The inn's door creaked open before I reached it. A man in his 70s stood there, clean clothes, calm face, eyes too bright. "You're lucky," he said simply. "You made it before sundown." "Is there another road out of town?" I asked. "There's only the one, always has been." "Then why is it gone?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured me in. I didn't want to enter. Every instinct screamed not to, but the sun was nearly gone and the air had grown strangely heavy, like something enormous was pressing down on the land. I stepped inside. The inn was cleaner than it looked from outside. Old wood floors, neatly arranged chairs, a long counter with a registry book lying open, a faint scent of cedar. "You'll take room 4, the man said, handing me a tarnished key. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone, not even if they sound familiar." A chill tore through me. "Why would someone sound familiar?" I asked. He paused long enough that I almost left right then. "Because this place likes repeating things," he said. "Echoes, copies, sometimes pieces of people linger." "What the hell does that mean?" He didn't answer. "Sun's gone," he instead whispered, looking past me toward the window. I turned. The sky outside had turned black. Not night, black, like ink poured over the horizon. "Upstairs," he said. "Now." I grabbed my backpack and hurried up the stairs, heart thudding. Room 4 was at the far end of the hall. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and shut it fast, bolting the lock and sliding the chain across. The room was simple: bed, small table, old lamp, window with thick curtains. I plugged in my phone. Dead. Not dying. Dead. I sat on the bed listening. At first, nothing. Then a noise. A dragging sound. Light. Slow. Like something being pulled across the street outside. I stood and moved the curtain a fraction of an inch. What I saw froze every breath in my lungs. The people I'd seen earlier were outside. But they weren't standing like people anymore. They were stretched thin, as if their limbs were made of taffy, arms too long, heads slightly too large, and turned at angles that weren't possible. They drifted more than walked, their bodies swaying like they were underwater. And they weren't alone. Shapes moved between them. Tall, black shapes that bent and twisted as though their bones were on the outside of their bodies. No features, just silhouettes that absorbed light. One stopped directly below my window. It raised its head, or what I guessed was its head, and sniffed the air. Slow, deliberate. Then it turned and looked straight up at me. It couldn't see me. I barely moved the curtain. The room was dark. But somehow it knew. The thing slowly lifted an arm, finger extended, and pointed directly at my window. I let the curtain fall and stumbled backward, hitting the wall behind me. For hours, maybe more, maybe less, time had no meaning. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed, listening to the dragging, the scraping, the whispering voices sliding across the walls like insects. At some point, exhaustion took me. I didn't fully sleep, but drifted into a half-conscious haze where the whispers threaded through my dreams. I dreamed of fields swallowing the road. I dreamed of buildings flickering in and out of existence. I dreamed of copies of myself, walking the street with limbs that bent the wrong way. When I jolted awake, the room was gray with early dawn. The air was heavy and still. Birds were singing somewhere. I crept to the window. The town looked normal again. No stretched people, no shadows walking on broken legs, no figures pointing at me. I grabbed my bag and bolted downstairs. No one was at the front desk. No sign of the innkeeper. The registry book was gone. Now the sky was brightening. The road looked normal again, pavement running straight toward the highway. I didn't think. I just ran for my car, threw my stuff in, and floored it hard enough to fishtail gravel. The buildings didn't disappear this time. No one stood in the road. No one pointed. I drove until the town was a small smudge in the mirror. Then it was gone again. Proper gone. The way abandoned towns dissolve into grass over decades. 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed back to life. GPS working, signal strong. The road behind me marked as a simple county route with no towns along it. I pulled into the first gas station I found. The cashier, a friendly guy in his 20s, asked where I'd come from. Morrow Ridge, I said without thinking. His smile faltered. Where? Morrow Ridge. About a half hour east. He shook his head slowly. There's nothing out there but fields, I insisted. Described the grain elevator, the sagging church, the inn. He paled. That place burned down, he said. Jesus, 15 years ago. Lightning strike. Killed almost the whole town. Nobody rebuilt. The land's empty now. Folks around here don't go near it. I tried to argue, but he raised a hand. Sir, whatever you saw out there, it wasn't Morrow Ridge. I left before he could say anything else. For months, I tried to convince myself I imagined everything. The people, the disappearing town, the creatures under the window. But then a package arrived at my house. No return address. Inside was my in-room key, room 4, and a single sheet of old, brittle paper that smelled of smoke. On it was a hand-drawn map of Morrow Ridge, except the buildings weren't drawn in ink. They were scratched into the paper as if by something sharp. A message along the bottom, written in a shaky, looping scrawl, read, "You came back once. You'll come back again. They always do." I burned the paper. I threw away the key. I moved across the country. But sometimes, especially at night, I hear a faint dragging sound outside my house. Slow. Patient. Like something pulling itself across the ground toward my window, and every so often, in the reflection of the glass, I see a shape behind me. Thin. Stretched. Pointing. Story the end. The gravel crunched under the tires as Jamie drove down the old back road, the kind that barely qualified as a road at all. Trees arched overhead, forming a thick canopy that blocked out most of the afternoon sun, leaving patches of shadow that seemed to stretch and crawl across the asphalt. She had taken this route hundreds of times, a shortcut to her aunt's cabin deep in the Appalachian hills. But today, something felt off. The air smelled stale, almost metallic, and the usual symphony of birds and insects was strangely silent. Even the wind seemed cautious, rustling through the leaves with an unnatural hesitation. Jamie tightened her grip on the steering wheel, trying to shake the unease. She told herself she was overthinking. After all, it was just a road through the woods, nothing more. Her aunt's cabin was only a few miles ahead, a small wooden structure with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged in the middle. But as she drove further, the trees seemed to close in, and the GPS on her phone sputtered and died. No signal. She pulled over, hoping to get a glimpse of her surroundings, but the forest was dense, dark, and silent. A low fog was beginning to creep along the ground, weaving between the trunks like fingers. Jamie stepped out, the gravel cold beneath her boots, and looked around. That's when she saw it. The faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the tree line, motionless, watching her. Her heart jumped. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. The figure didn't move. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its head seemed slightly too large for its body. It tilted its head, almost curiously, before retreating silently into the woods. Jamie swallowed hard and jumped back into her car, locking the doors. She wanted to tell herself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow, her imagination. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it had been watching her for more than a few seconds. She pressed on, taking the turns slower, every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves making her flinch. By the time she reached the cabin, the sun had dipped behind the mountains and twilight had swallowed the forest. Her aunt's place looked the same. Quiet, deserted, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Inside, the cabin was musty but familiar. Jamie flicked on the lights, the bulbs flickering for a moment before stabilizing. She checked the locks on the windows and doors, double, triple-checking each one. Her aunt, who had been out running errands, wasn't due back for another few hours. Jamie tried to shake the fear, telling herself that whoever or whatever she'd seen was gone. Hours passed uneventfully, the wind picking up outside, whistling through cracks in the siding. Jamie sat on the worn sofa, curled up with a blanket and a book she barely touched. Every creak of the cabin floor, every bump against the walls made her jump. Around midnight, the power went out. Complete darkness swallowed the cabin, and the usual hum of the fridge and old wiring ceased. She fumbled for a flashlight, her hands shaking, clicking it on to reveal a small circle of dim light. That's when she heard it. A soft tapping at the window. Tap, tap, tap. Her breath caught. She froze, listening. The sound stopped. She shined the flashlight across the yard, but the fog had thickened, reducing visibility to just a few feet. A shadow moved, quick and silent, just beyond the edge of the light. Jamie's hands trembled as she backed away from the window, feeling the panic rise. She tried calling her aunt, but there was no signal. The landline was dead. The tapping returned, this time louder, more deliberate. Her stomach churned, and she knew she wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was out there, circling the cabin. She remembered the figure on the road, the way it had tilted its head, and fear rooted her to the spot. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. Then a loud thump echoed from the back door. Jamie rushed to check, flashlight raised, and saw nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, fog rolling through the yard. Panic pushed her to the kitchen, where she grabbed a knife, holding it as tightly as she could. Her eyes darted to every window, every shadow, every movement in the fog. She realized she wasn't just scared, she was being hunted. Something in the way the air felt, heavy and watchful, told her it knew she was inside. She moved to the front door, heart hammering, but froze when she saw the mud tracks leading up from the woods. Odd, narrow tracks, like someone had walked lightly, deliberately, coming right up to the porch before disappearing. A sudden noise behind her made her spin around. Her flashlight caught movement, brief, fleeting, just at the edge of the kitchen doorway. She ran to the stairs, fumbling with the lock on the attic door, hoping to find somewhere to hide. The attic smelled of old insulation and dust, but it offered some sense of security. She pressed herself into a corner, holding the knife, listening. Footsteps circled the cabin, slow, deliberate, soft on the wood and earth. They stopped outside the attic window. Jamie held her breath as the window rattled from the weight of something leaning against it. She dared not move. The tapping on the glass was replaced by scratching, nails scraping, slow, methodical. Hours passed, the scratching faded, then the fog outside seemed to press against the walls, almost alive. When the first light of dawn crept into the cabin, Jamie cautiously climbed down. The yard was empty. The mud tracks were gone. Nothing remained except for a single unnerving footprint at the base of the porch steps, too long and thin to be human. She didn't sleep. She packed her things and left before her aunt returned. On the drive back, she passed the same stretch of road where she had first seen the figure. Nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the empty forest. But she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her, hiding behind every tree. Weeks later, she called her aunt to tell her about the night. Her aunt listened, then paused before speaking. "You saw it too," she said quietly. "You weren't supposed to see it. Most people never do. We live too close to the old forest, too close to the things that watch from the shadows." "What things?" Jamie asked, voice shaking. Her aunt didn't answer. She changed the subject, but Jamie could tell by the silence that she knew something terrible. That there was something in the woods that had followed her home, something patient, something that didn't like to be noticed but always noticed. Weeks turned into months. Jamie moved to the city, convinced herself it was over. But sometimes in the middle of the night she would wake to a faint tapping on her window, the memory of those long fingers on the glass, and the feeling of being watched, patient and silent, waiting for her to be alone again. She tried telling friends, but they laughed it off. Wild imagination, stress, the isolation of the mountains. No one else had seen it, no one else had heard the scratches in the night. Yet she knew. She couldn't forget the way it tilted its head, the unnatural proportions, the slow, deliberate movements in the fog. She couldn't forget that it had found her once and could find her again. Years later, Jamie returned to the area, older, braver, or perhaps foolish. The road was still there, but abandoned, overgrown, cracked. The GPS signal came and went as she drove, the forest thick and silent. She stopped at the same place where she had first seen the figure. Nothing, just shadows stretching across the foggy asphalt. But then, movement, a flicker, a dark shape between the trees, too tall, too thin, tilting its head in the same eerie way. Jamie's heart pounded. She wanted to run, wanted to escape, But something compelled her to stay. The figure stepped out of the tree line slowly, deliberately, until it vanished into the fog, leaving only silence. She felt its eyes on her even as she drove away, and she knew that no matter how far she went, how far she moved, the memory would always follow. Some things in the woods weren't meant to be seen. Some things watched, patient and silent, waiting for the moment to cross the line from shadow to reality. Jamie didn't speak of it for years, but sometimes late at night she could still hear the tapping on her window, feel the presence just beyond the glass, reminding her that some corners of the world are best left alone. Even now, she thinks of the tall, thin figure when she drives through isolated roads or hears the faint crackle of something moving in the dark. It's always watching, always waiting, and she knows that the next time it appears, there may be no escaping it. Story the end. The sun had just dipped behind the jagged silhouette of the Appalachian ridges, leaving the valley swallowed in a violet twilight. Jason and Melissa had been driving for hours, the highway narrowing into winding country roads that were more familiar to deer than to humans. Their plan was simple: a weekend getaway at a small rustic cabin Jason had rented from a local in West Virginia. The GPS signal had disappeared long before the turnoff, and the only sounds inside the car were the hum of the engine and the occasional murmur of the radio, struggling to catch a signal in the hills. By the time they found the gravel path leading up to the cabin, night had fully settled. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches scratching against the car roof in a ghostly rhythm, as if warning them to turn back. Melissa shivered despite the warmth of the heater, her eyes darting to the shadows moving unnaturally in the corners of the windshield. Jason tried to laugh it off, joking about country horror movie vibes, but even he couldn't ignore the knot forming in his stomach. The cabin itself was small, almost a forgotten relic with weathered wood and a crooked chimney that emitted no smoke. There was a single flickering light inside, and the door creaked as Jason pushed it open. Inside smelled of damp pine and something faintly metallic, like old blood. The furniture was basic: a sagging couch, a rickety table, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. They unpacked quickly, determined to settle in before complete darkness enveloped them. Jason started a fire in the stove while Melissa wandered toward the windows, peering into the inky black forest. That's when she saw it. At first, she thought it was a deer, a black shape moving silently between the trees. But then it stopped and she realized its posture was wrong. Too upright, too still, like it was watching them. When she pointed it out to Jason, he laughed nervously, saying it was probably just a trick of the shadows. But the feeling didn't leave her. Something was out there, and it knew they were there. The first night was restless. Every snap of a branch and rustle of leaves outside the cabin made Melissa jump. Jason tried to reassure her, but his own eyes kept darting toward the dark window frames. At one point, they both heard a low, guttural growl emanating from the woods. It wasn't a wolf. Wolves didn't growl like that, not in that long, drawn-out way that vibrated through the chest. In the morning, they tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe they were imagining things. Jason decided to go for a hike to clear his head, promising Melissa he'd be back before sunset. She stayed behind, cleaning up and trying to keep herself busy. Hours passed, and the sunlight waned, stretching shadows across the cabin floor. That's when the first knock came. It was slow, deliberate, and it echoed unnaturally through the cabin. Melissa froze, her hand clutching the edge of the counter. Another knock, and another. She called out for Jason, her voice trembling, but there was no answer. She grabbed her phone. No service. Panic rising, she rushed to the window. Between the trees, she could just make out a figure standing motionless, watching. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and the way it held itself, still, rigid, silent, was wrong. It didn't look human, but it was, somehow. The knocking turned to banging, the wood of the door shaking under the force of someone or something trying to get in. Melissa's mind raced. She knew she had to escape, but there was no car nearby, and the path was swallowed by the dark forest. She grabbed a flashlight and a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, her heart hammering in her chest. Suddenly, she heard movement outside. Footsteps. Slow, careful, circling the cabin. Her flashlight flicked across the yard, and for a terrifying moment, she saw multiple figures emerging from the trees. Tall, thin, faceless and moving with an inhuman grace. They didn't run. They glided. Their heads swiveled as if they were assessing her, studying her. She screamed and backed away, only to hear the unmistakable crunch of a window breaking behind her. Jason stumbled in through the door he'd somehow reopened. He was pale, covered in scratches and dirt. He grabbed Melissa and shoved her toward the back exit. "Run! Just run!" he yelled. They bolted into the forest, guided only by the thin beam of Melissa's flashlight. Branches whipped their faces, roots tore at their feet, but they didn't stop. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit began. Low hissing, guttural snarls, and a chilling, almost human laughter that echoed through the trees. Hours, or maybe minutes, time had lost all meaning. They ran blindly until they found a logging road. They collapsed there, gasping, listening for any sound of pursuit. There was nothing, just the occasional rustle of leaves and distant owl calls. They walked along the road until they finally reached a small gas station, where they called the police. The officers arrived, and while they took their statement, they were skeptical. "You're deep in the backwoods," one officer said. "Could have been anything. Bears, maybe, or some pranksters." But both Jason and Melissa knew it wasn't anything human, not entirely. Weeks later, they learned that the cabin had been abandoned for decades, supposedly the site of multiple disappearances dating back to the 1970s. Locals whispered of a family that had vanished without a trace, and the strange humanoid sightings that continued into the modern day. Some described them as shadow people, others as skinwalkers, the kind of entities that preyed on those who dared to wander too far off the map. Jason and Melissa never returned. They sold their car, changed numbers, and avoided the country roads that had led them there. But the memory never left. Every time they closed their eyes at night, they saw those figures, standing silently in the darkness, watching, waiting. What haunted them the most was not the chase or the scratches or the night in the forest. It was the feeling of being studied, of being chosen. They never heard from anyone else who had stayed in that cabin, and the locals refused to talk about it. Every piece of technology they tried to use in the area, phones, GPS, cameras, malfunctioned or captured only static. It was as if the land itself conspired to erase them from memory, to keep the truth hidden. Years later, Jason attempted to document their experience online, posting vague descriptions on forums dedicated to paranormal encounters. He never mentioned the cabin's location. But he did share a photograph, a blurry image of something tall and black, barely visible behind the trees. It was enough to draw attention, enough to spark warnings from anonymous users who claimed to have seen the same figures in the woods near their own remote homes. Melissa, meanwhile, became obsessed with researching the history of the Appalachian backwoods. She uncovered accounts from hikers, hunters, and old journal entries from families long gone. Nearly every story contained the same elements: strange silhouettes in the night, inhuman sounds, an oppressive feeling of being watched. Some of the entries described close encounters where the victims had been examined or tagged by entities before being allowed to leave. Others hinted at disappearances, sometimes leaving behind only a piece of clothing or a bloodied footprint as evidence. On particularly dark nights, Melissa would wake to the feeling that someone or something was in her bedroom. No shadows, no noises, but the air felt thick, heavy, as if carrying a presence. Jason experienced the same. Sleep became impossible, dreams filled with endless forests and faceless watchers. They were never physically harmed after that night, but the psychological impact was relentless. They were left with a terror that no one could see, a horror that existed in the space between sight and feeling. The story didn't end with that cabin. Over the years, reports of similar encounters appeared across the rural United States, in the plains of Kansas, the backwoods of Maine, the deserts of Arizona. All reported humanoid figures, impossible to describe fully, always observing, rarely attacking directly, and always disappearing when approached. Some researchers speculated these were remnants of some undiscovered species, others that they were interdimensional predators, slipping between reality and something else entirely. But to those who had seen them firsthand, like Jason and Melissa, it didn't matter. They existed, and they watched. Even today, years after fleeing the cabin, Jason and Melissa cannot drive past rural roads without checking the tree lines for movement. A branch cracking, a shadow shifting, or the fleeting glint of something unnatural sets their hearts racing. Friends and family dismiss their warnings, attributing it to trauma or overactive imaginations, but neither of them could ever forget that night. They know what they saw, they know what followed them, and most importantly, they know that in the deepest, most remote corners of the country, there are places where humans are not the top predators and where the darkness itself has eyes. Story the end. It was a late October afternoon when Emily and her boyfriend Mark decided to take the long, winding back road drive out to the old family cabin. The place had been in Emily's family for generations, tucked deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, far from any real town. People didn't come out there much, except for the occasional hunter or someone foolish enough to take the forest roads in the winter without proper preparation. Emily hadn't been there in years, and Mark had never been. They'd wanted a weekend away, something quiet, nothing fancy, just them, the trees, and the lake that glimmered at the end of the dirt path. The drive out was slow. The sun was already leaning toward the horizon, giving the trees an orange glow. There was that strange quiet that comes when you're far from everything. No hum of traffic, no neighbors chatting, just the wind through the bare branches. Emily laughed nervously as Mark tried to navigate the forest roads with his phone GPS, which kept losing signal. "Are you sure this is the right turn?" Mark asked, his voice tight. Emily squinted at the crumbling road sign. "Yeah, it's just, I don't know. It looks different." The dirt road narrowed, flanked by trees so close they seemed to bend over the car, creating tunnels of shadows. Somewhere behind them, a branch snapped, but when they glanced in the rearview mirror, nothing was there. Emily's stomach churned slightly, but she brushed it off as nerves. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had dipped completely, leaving only the dim glow of the moon. The cabin looked abandoned. Dusty windows, a porch sagging in the middle, the faint smell of damp wood wafting through the broken screen door. Emily hesitated at the threshold. "It hasn't been this rundown before." "Maybe it's just the weather," Mark said, forcing a smile. "It's fine." Inside, the air was heavy. The cabin smelled of old wood, rot, and something else Emily couldn't place. She flicked on the light switch. Nothing happened. Just as she was about to groan in frustration, she noticed the fireplace. Cold ashes, but arranged almost carefully. Mark moved to check the doors and windows. Every single lock seemed intact, but the sense of being watched clung to them both. They decided to make the best of it. Mark unpacked their small bags while Emily started a fire in the fireplace. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the broken shutters. Somewhere, deep in the forest, something moved. A low, dragging sound like someone or something was walking across the leaves. Emily froze. "Did you hear that?" Mark shrugged, pretending casualness, but he too had heard it. Probably a deer. Or a raccoon. The first night was uneventful, but neither of them slept well. Every creak of the cabin made them flinch. Emily thought she saw shadows moving outside, but when she checked, nothing was there. By morning, she was jittery, convinced something was off. The next day, they went to the lake. Emily loved the silence of the water, the way it reflected the gray sky. Mark fished while she walked along the shore, skipping stones. As she rounded a bend, she noticed tracks, deep, wide, and strangely human-like, leading from the tree line toward the lake. Her pulse quickened. She took photos, thinking maybe it was a bear or worse, someone camping nearby. But there were no signs of tents or fire. When she showed Mark, his face went pale. "Those look like they could be human, but I don't know." That evening, Emily heard a whisper, just a single low whisper from outside the cabin. She bolted upright in bed. "Mark?" But he was already awake, staring at the window, eyes wide. "I heard it too," he said, voice trembling. It's saying your name." They tried to convince themselves it was the wind, but the whispers continued each night, always calling Emily, always from outside. The scratching at the windows became louder, more deliberate. Emily began to dread nightfall, each sound amplified in the stillness of the forest. On the third day, Emily decided to explore the surrounding woods. She grabbed a flashlight and told Mark she'd be careful. But as soon as she stepped into the trees, the world seemed to close in. The forest was dense, almost suffocating. Branches snagged her jacket, roots tripped her, and shadows seemed to flicker in the corners of her vision. After a while, she stumbled across a clearing. The ground was littered with old, rotting furniture, chairs, tables, even a mattress. And in the center, a circle had been carved into the dirt, lined with stones. In the middle of the circle, a crude figure had been made from sticks and animal bones. Emily's stomach churned. She backed away slowly, but that's when she saw footprints surrounding the circle. Wide, deep, human-shaped, but with claws. A twig snapped behind her. Emily spun around. A figure stood there. Tall, impossibly thin, wearing a tattered cloak that blended with the shadows. Its face, she couldn't see it, but it didn't need a face. Emily felt the weight of its gaze. Panic surged through her. She ran, tripping over roots, crashing through underbrush until she burst back onto the cabin porch, gasping. Mark was there, holding a flashlight. Emily, what happened? She tried to explain, but words failed her. The fear in her eyes said everything. They decided to leave immediately, packing their things in silence. As they drove back, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. Every turn looked the same. Every shadow seemed alive. Then the engine sputtered and died. Mark cursed, hitting the steering wheel. Emily looked out into the trees, and there it was, just for a moment, a tall figure standing between two trees, watching. Then it vanished. They managed to push the car to the side of the road and call for a tow. The operator sounded skeptical when Mark explained where they were. That's really far out. You sure you're in Minnesota? The tow truck arrived hours later. As they climbed into the cab, Emily glanced back at the forest. The whispers were gone, the shadows still, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them to the edge of the road just out of sight. Back in town, they tried to rationalize what had happened. Stress, Mark said. Isolation. Cabin fever. But Emily knew. She had seen it, felt it. Something lived there, something ancient and patient, that watched those foolish enough to enter its domain. Years later, Emily still avoids that part of Minnesota entirely. She's never been able to forget the circle, the footprints, or the whisper of her name in the night. Sometimes when she closes her eyes, she swears she can see those hollow shadows moving just beyond the trees, waiting. Her friends think she's exaggerating, but when they see her flinch at the sound of a twig snapping or the way she avoids old forest roads, they start to believe. Because Emily doesn't need to see it again to know. It's still out there, waiting, watching. And one day, it might decide she's come back. Story the end. It started on a Wednesday morning. I remember the smell of wet earth and the creaky old windows of the farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. The address was something like County Road 12, 5 miles past the old red silo. But by the time I got there, the road was little more than packed dirt, overgrown grass creeping in at the edges, nicks in the surface where winter frost had cracked it, and heat had bubbled it up. My name is Ryan Mills. I was 26, and I'd taken the job partly for the solitude. I'd grown up in a city with noise and traffic and public transit, and I needed something quiet. Somewhere I could breathe, somewhere I could sleep without hearing car horns or jets overhead. So when the ad came through, caretaker for remote property, house, barn, fields, isolation undesirable but negotiable, must stay the winter, utilities on generator, contact Sam at XXX, I thought, great. A little cabin, a big piece of land, all mine for a while. When I drove up that first day, the house stood back 50 yards from the road, a low-slope roof, shingles worn, paint peeling. The barn was set a little further behind. To the right, a narrow creek wound lazily through the pasture. No neighbors visible for miles. As I unloaded my small duffel bag and a box of groceries, canned beans, pasta, frozen meat, my mind fluttered with excitement and a thin tingle of unease. Just the kind of mix you'd expect when you're out in the middle of nowhere. And maybe the nowhere part was the whole point. The days that followed were calm. I spent mornings walking the land, checking fence lines, repairing broken board slats, making sure gates closed. The wind played through the tall grass, a hawk circled overhead. At dusk, I'd cook something modest, roast chicken leg, mashed potatoes, and sip black coffee on the porch, listening to the creek gurgling. At night, the power flicked off at 8 o'clock and the generator kicked in. I felt almost primitive, in a good way. The sky exploded with stars, no city glow to dim them. I slept with the door unlocked, yes, I know, foolish, and woke once or twice to the creek or to the wind in the pine trees. Then the odd things started. A tinge of wrongness, subtle but persistent. The first sign came on a Thursday evening. I'd been reading in the living room. A single lamp, cat curled beside me. The owners left their pet Ruby for the caretaker. The wind rose sharply. The lampshade gently rattled. I paused and looked toward the window. The glass was dark, but the reflection of me, I swear, I thought I saw a figure behind me. In the shadow. It was just a flicker. I blinked. Nothing. Maybe the backyard tree branch hitting the glass. I told myself that. But I didn't sleep well that night. The darkness felt heavier. The house creaked in unfamiliar ways. Friday morning, I found footprints in the fresh frost on the back porch. I didn't lock the door, but I locked the porch gate as soon as I saw them. The prints were about 11 inches long, and they weren't booted. They looked like bare feet or thin-soled shoes. I chalked it up to a possible sleepy farmer wandering through, or an old caretaker stopping by and forgetting to sign in. But the curiosity was there. Who had passed by? No other houses visible, no neighbors that I'd met. That afternoon I heard a distant scream. It wasn't a scream like help me, more like a sharp, anguished cry, cut off abruptly. It came across the pasture, somewhere beyond the tree line. I dropped the wrench in my hand and stared. The creek glowed silver, nothing else. I tried the radio, no signal. I tried my cell, no bars. I walked outside and looked around, all calm. A hawk perched on a dead tree trunk. Fine. But my heart hammered. I went back inside and locked the main door. Later, I found marks on the barn door. The bottom left hinge had been bent outward slightly, as though someone had forced it. I replaced the hinge, tightened screws, secured the door. Still, I slept with the cat Ruby curled in my arms and the hammer under the pillow. Saturday brought snow, just a light dusting, enough to whiten the grass. In the morning, I went out to boot up the generator room. It's a small shed just to the left of the house. As I flicked the switch, I heard something behind me. The sound of boots, or at least heavy footsteps moving across the snow-covered grass. I froze. The steps approached the shed, and then stopped. I stood motionless, breath visible in cold air. Nothing else moved. After maybe 30 seconds, I looked out the door. Wide open, the hinge bent again. I stared at the field stretched out toward the tree line, then locked the shed and retraced the steps inside. I didn't sleep that night. Sunday morning, I left the house to walk down toward the creek. I followed the narrow path, patches of ice, winter willow branches hanging. The stream glistened. I inhaled cold air. Then something in the water caught my eye. A bright red scarf, partially submerged near the bank, tangled in reeds. I pulled it out. Looks like a woman's scarf, a silken red scarf. I thought about who could have lost it. I scanned the bank. Footprints. Large footprints, almost human, but the pattern was odd. The toe area smudged. Someone walking naked foot? Bare toes? I frowned. I tucked the scarf inside my jacket and headed back. I showed it to Ruby, cat, confused, and considered mailing it to the owner's address further down in the city, but I tucked it away instead. I felt the privacy of the house infringed. Something not right. At dinner I heard scratching. Along the wall of the living room. A light but distinct scratch, like claws or fingernails. I froze. The lamp flickered. I pulled the hammer from under my pillow and stood up, shining the flashlight toward the wall. Nothing. After a minute, the sound stopped. I tried to think of dogs scratching outside, maybe raccoons, maybe wind, maybe the tree branch hitting the siding, but I knew the sound was inside the wall. I left the living room, went to bed early. The scratching returned around midnight, louder this time, and then there was a whisper, very faint, as though the house exhaled. I held the hammer until dawn. The next morning I contacted the owner, Sam, via satellite phone. "Everything okay?" he said breezily. "Remote property always produce strange noises. Frozen pipes, moose, coyotes, don't worry." I said yes. I said thanks. I didn't say I heard whispering. Monday I tried to distract myself, checked fences, did inventory of food supplies, cleaned the barn. But about mid-afternoon I realized the red scarf was gone from my jacket pocket. I searched everywhere. Coat pockets, laundry hamper, cat bed. Gone. I felt a deep sinking sensation. I looked out the windows. Nothing. The wind gusted. The barn door hinge was again bent. My heart thudded. I shredded sleep that night. I turned on every light at dusk, left them on. But the silence pressed in. Tuesday dawned with gray light. I walked out to inspect the fence down near the tree line. As I approached, I saw something. The fence boards near the tree line had been broken away, 3 of them pried outward. The nails had been pulled, not hammered. I stared at the broken spot, thinking someone had done this late last night. But who? And why? I looked back toward the house. No lights. I backed away quietly. I went home, locked the doors, and sat by the window with the cat Ruby. Later that evening, while I sat at the table eating cold soup, I heard the sound again, a child giggle. High-pitched, soft, right outside the window. I froze. I looked out. Nothing but snow-covered grass and the dark tree line. I pulled the curtain shut and backed away. But I heard footsteps in the snow. Soft, hesitant footsteps. They approached the porch. I gripped my hammer. The porch light was on. I flicked off the inside lights so I could see outside better. On the snow, there was a single footstep. One print leading to the porch, then another just at the edge of the porch. Barefoot print. Then nothing. The wind blew again. I ducked into bed and kept the windows locked. Wednesday morning, I greeted the sunrise in a kind of panic. I took my heavy coat and drove the old pickup. They provided one down to the nearest town, 6 miles away, to pick up supplies. As I backed out, I looked at the house and saw someone standing at the tree line. Slender form, long coat, back turned toward me. Bare feet visible. I hit the brakes. They didn't move. Then I slammed it into drive and accelerated away. In town, I bought a cellular signal booster, pepper spray, extra locks, and left. When I returned, the house looked undisturbed, the porch light on, the barn door hinge bent more. I considered leaving the job. But the owner reminded me of the contract. Winter kept me there. It paid well. I felt trapped, but even still, I remained. Thursday night, it got worse. I walked Ruby out to the barn to feed the goat. Yes, there was a goat too. On the way back, I heard a scraping sound just beyond the barn door. I flicked my flashlight. Nothing. I moved toward the barn door and noticed 2 boot prints in the dusty dirt inside the barn, where none should be. Someone had been inside. I froze. I issued a low hiss at Ruby to stay back. I reached for the pepper spray in my coat pocket. I crept forward. My flashlight beam swept across the barn. Feed sacks, old hay bales, 2 boots, empty boots, stood upright in one corner. I blinked. I handed feed to the goat and left fast. That night, I barely slept. I barricaded the barn door from inside and loaded the shotgun that I found locked in the closet. The house came with weapons for rural predator control. I held the hammer on the bed beside me. Friday morning, the low sun cast odd shadows through the windows. I looked outside and saw the red scarf again, flapping from a branch of the willow by the creek bank. I stepped out, tripped on something in the snow. Another clue. I pulled the scarf down. It looked worn, wet, frozen in spots. I stared across the creek into the dark woods. My throat closed. I dragged the scarf inside, locked the door. Later that day, I decided to track the footprints to the tree line. Bare feet prints running from the bank past the broken fence toward the barn. I followed them to the thick woods. The tracks disappeared. But inside the wood, I found a crude cairn of stones, little pile, and inside the pile, a stick with carvings. Too faint for me to identify, but looked like letters or maybe symbols. Go. Now. Maybe you. I didn't know. I snapped a photo with my phone. The woods were hushed. The branches above seemed to lean. I shivered, packed up, and returned to the house quickly. That night, the house groaned with wind, the generator thrumming. The porch light flickered and went out for a second. I jumped up and went outside. No one there but Ruby's fur shimmering in the light. I locked the door and sat in the living room with the shotgun and hammer. I stared at the wall where the scratching had been. It started again. Scratch, scratch. But this time I heard breathing behind the wall. Slow, ragged. I slammed my shoulder into the wall. A hollow sound. Then silence. Saturday came. I couldn't eat much. I couldn't focus. I kept the curtains drawn. Then about midday the weather turned. Wind picked up. Snow swirled. The house rocked. I walked to the generator shed to check the fuel. I heard footsteps in the snow and let the door slam. I locked it from inside. The print outside were very large. I took photos. I retreated. Then the final incident. Saturday night at 11 p.m., I heard Ruby hiss like a cat that's furious from the basement. I opened the door and the basement light was on. I told myself I had turned it off earlier. I crouched and grabbed the hammer. I crept down the stairs. The bulb flickered. The basement was cold, air damp. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw writing on the floor in what looked like soot or ash. Stay. I froze. I swear the gloom in the basement deepened. My heart pounded. I backed up slowly. The writing blurred. A figure moved at the far side of the basement, just in the corner where the light didn't reach. Tall, thin, barefoot, long coat moving gently. The shape looked at me, head tilted. I raised the shotgun and fired a warning blast into the ceiling. The house echoed. The figure didn't flinch. Then it turned and walked through a wall, or maybe vanished. I don't know. I ran upstairs, locked every door, held Ruby close, and waited until dawn. When the morning came, I packed what I could, stepped outside. The fresh footprint trail headed toward the woods again. I left. I didn't tell the owner much, just that I had to leave. He said, "You sure?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay," and that was that. Even now, I don't fully know what I saw. I don't know if the figure was alive, dead, ghost, what kind of thing. The isolation made every sound louder, every shadow deeper. Out in the middle of nowhere, without help, without neighbors. Something broke the rules. I sold the contract, kept the pictures. The red scarf is in a box under my bed. I sleep with the window shut tight. Occasionally, I hear a floorboard creak at night, and I think of the barn, the broken fence, the footprints. I wonder if someone else went to that house after me. I hope not. Story the end. The small town of Eads, Colorado wasn't much more than a scattering of homes, a gas station, and a diner. It sat at the edge of nowhere, surrounded by endless plains that rolled into jagged mesas, where the wind carried a loneliness heavier than silence. Most of the locals had lived there their entire lives and knew the stories, the ones you didn't talk about too loudly, the ones that made kids check over their shoulders at night. It started with Sam. He was a young man in his 20s, new to the area, working at a farm south of town. He liked the quiet, the way the sky seemed so big you could get lost in it. But the solitude came with a catch. People in Eads didn't welcome strangers warmly, and more than one old-timer warned him about wandering too far, about the old roads that no longer appeared on maps. One Friday evening, Sam decided to take a shortcut home through a stretch of dirt road that cut across a canyon he'd never been through. The sun was dipping low, painting everything in gold and red, and he felt a thrill, the kind of thrill that makes people ignore the little voice in their head telling them to turn around. The road was narrow, bordered by scrub and rock. A quarter-mile in, he noticed something odd. Tire tracks that didn't belong to his truck. They were deep, wide, like a truck or SUV had passed recently, but the patterns were irregular, almost meandering. He shrugged. Maybe a rancher, he thought. But then the smell hit him, a coppery metallic stench that made his stomach twist. It wasn't blood. Not exactly. It was worse. He pulled over and stepped out. The wind was sharp, carrying dust that stung his eyes. He saw them then, small, shallow depressions in the dirt, too uniform to be natural. They weren't human footprints, not really. Elongated, almost clawed at the ends, leading off the road toward the edge of the canyon. Sam's rational mind tried to explain it. Animal tracks, maybe coyotes or a large dog, but there were too many, crisscrossing in patterns that didn't make sense for hunting or wandering. His unease grew, and he climbed back into his truck, doors locked, heart thumping. That night, Sam didn't sleep. The wind howled outside his small rented cabin, rattling windows and doors. Around midnight, he heard it, a soft, deliberate scratching, like nails scraping across wood. It wasn't the wind. It was outside. He grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat and stepped onto the porch. Nothing. Just darkness stretching into the plains. He shook his head, telling himself he was imagining things. But then the wind shifted, carrying a whisper. "Sam?" The voice was low, raspy, almost human, but broken. He froze. The sound came again, closer this time, almost under the porch. Sam ran inside, locked every door, and stayed up until dawn, listening as the whispers faded. He told no one, thinking he'd go back to the canyon in daylight and see the tracks again, maybe find a rational explanation. The next day, he drove out to the spot. The tracks were gone, but something else had appeared. Scratches, deep gouges in the rock walls, vertical and perfectly spaced. He shone his flashlight across them, heart thumping. The patterns looked like writing, jagged and harsh, but not in any language he recognized. He took a photo and sent it to a local, an older man named Henry, who had been a sheriff decades ago. Henry replied quickly, "You don't touch it. You don't go back. Some roads are better left alone." Sam laughed it off, but the warning echoed in his head as the sun sank low. That night, the whispers returned, this time more persistent, circling the cabin. Sometimes they called his name. Sometimes they were joined by scraping sounds, like someone or something moving in the walls. Sleep became impossible. He started hearing things while driving, footsteps on the dirt outside, shapes moving at the edge of the headlights. A shadow once appeared in his rearview mirror, not from behind the truck, but standing in the middle of the road, silhouetted by the moonlight. When he swerved, it was gone. One evening, he decided to leave Eads. He packed quickly, loaded his truck, and drove out past the canyon road, taking the main highway this time. For a while, everything seemed normal. Then, near a desolate stretch with no signs of habitation for miles, the truck behind him appeared. Same make, same model, black, no plates. Sam had never seen it before, but now it was there, tailing him, keeping distance, mirroring his every turn. He tried to lose it, taking side roads, but no matter where he went, the truck appeared again. On one dirt path that ended at a dry riverbed, he saw it parked at the far end, engine off. There was no driver, just the outline of a figure, tall, unnaturally still, staring toward him. He floored the gas, barely breathing. For hours, the truck stayed behind, keeping pace silently. When he reached the next town and finally stopped at a gas station, the black truck was gone. Sam tried to tell the attendant, but the man laughed, shaking his head. "No one's been following you. You're imagining things. That road's empty. Always has been." But Sam wasn't imagining things. He knew what he'd seen. For weeks, he tried to forget, but the nightmares returned. He would wake in the night to the sound of scratching at his windows, whispers calling his name, and glimpses of that shadow in the corner of his room. His phone began receiving texts from unknown numbers. Each one contained a single line, in the same jagged pattern he'd seen in the canyon. "You shouldn't have left." The last straw came one night when he decided to confront it. Armed with a flashlight and a hunting knife, he drove to the canyon road. The moon was hidden behind clouds, darkness thick and suffocating. The truck appeared at the edge of the trees, exactly where it had been in his nightmares. Sam stopped. The figure got out. It walked toward him, slow, deliberate, limbs too long, movements unnatural. As it approached, the air turned cold, every hair on his body standing on end. The whispers surrounded him, calling names he didn't recognize, yet somehow he felt they knew him, had always known him. He swung his flashlight, blinding it for a moment. In that brief light, he saw the face, pale, elongated, eyes black, mouth stretched too wide in a smile. Then it lunged. The next morning, the truck was gone. Sam's cabin was empty. His phone lay on the floor, screen cracked, battery dead. Neighbors reported no one moving in or out. Those who drove past said the canyon road was quiet, abandoned, as if no one had been there for years. Sometimes far out on the plains, travelers say they see a black truck parked along the dirt roads, engine off, a figure inside staring at the horizon. And if you drive too close, the whispers begin, calling your name, drawing you toward the canyon, toward nowhere, where the wind carries the voices of the lost. No one knows what happened to Sam, but some nights, when the wind is high, you can hear a faint rasping whisper along the road, and the black truck waits, patient, silent, ready for the next soul foolish enough to wander too far. Story the end. The road was a thin ribbon of cracked asphalt, winding through miles of dense pine forest, far from the nearest town. Emma and her boyfriend Luke had decided on a last-minute weekend trip to a secluded lake in northern Minnesota, the kind of place where the map shows water and trees, but nothing else. Their plan was simple: escape the city for 2 nights, fish, hike, and disconnect. The air smelled of wet pine and moss as they drove, and with each mile the sunlight faded, swallowed by towering trees. By the time they reached the dirt track leading to the lake, the car's headlights barely cut through the darkness. Emma's phone had no signal for hours, and the GPS had been useless for miles. Luke parked near the old wooden dock where the water glimmered faintly under the thin crescent of a new moon. The cabin they rented was tucked back in the trees, a single-story wooden structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. It looked exactly like the kind of place that belonged in a horror movie, and Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and mold. They unpacked, set up a small fire in the stone hearth, and tried to settle in. The first night was quiet, apart from the occasional rustle of small animals outside. But sometime around midnight, Emma woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Not the soft tap of a deer or raccoon. These were heavy, deliberate, slow. She nudged Luke, who groaned and rolled over, insisting it was just the wind. Emma, however, couldn't shake the unease. She peeked through the cracked blinds and saw nothing, just darkness. By the next morning, the unease had grown into something heavier. The forest seemed alive in a way that was almost conscious, shadows shifting unnaturally. Luke laughed nervously, suggesting that their minds were playing tricks after so many horror stories they'd watched before the trip. Emma didn't respond. She was already drawn to the window, watching the woods, and then she saw it, a figure at the edge of the tree line. At first, she thought it was a man, tall and hunched, staring in their direction, but the way it moved or didn't move was wrong. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its arms hung in a way no humans would. It just stood, watching, its form black against the morning light. Emma shook Luke awake, pointing, but by the time he looked, it was gone. They decided to hike the nearby trail to calm themselves, taking turns keeping watch. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual bird calls absent, the only sound their own footsteps on the forest floor. Hours into the hike, they found strange markings on the trees, deep gouges that didn't look like claw marks from any animal they recognized. Emma's stomach churned. The scratches were deliberate, a warning. They returned to the cabin, and the unease only deepened. That night, the sound started again. First low, guttural growls from the tree line, then whispers, indistinct, almost human but wrong in tone. The temperature inside the cabin dropped suddenly, and the fire in the hearth flickered as if responding to some invisible force. Emma pressed herself against Luke, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a bear was circling, maybe some pranksters in the area, but deep down she knew it was something else. Around midnight, there was a pounding on the cabin door, heavy, relentless. Emma clutched a kitchen knife, heart hammering, while Luke tried to look through the window. There was nothing there, just darkness. The pounding stopped. Silence. And then a scratching at the windows, slow and deliberate, moving from pane to pane, always just out of sight. Luke, finally panicking, suggested they leave immediately, get back to the road. Emma grabbed her bag, flashlight, and phone, though still no signal, and they ran out into the forest, following the faint light of the moon. Branches lashed their faces, roots tripped them, but they kept running. Behind them, the sounds followed. A dragging, a soft crunch, and low, unnatural humming. Occasionally a branch would snap closer than it should have, as if something was keeping pace with them without effort. They stumbled onto a service road at dawn, collapsing into exhaustion. Cars rarely passed that road, but eventually a local pickup stopped. The driver, an older man, gave them a hard look when they tried to explain what happened. "You folks stay near the lake?" he asked slowly. "That place, people disappear out there. Doesn't matter how careful you are. Woods don't like visitors." Emma and Luke never returned to Minnesota. They avoided forests, back roads, and anything resembling isolation. But the nightmares followed. In dreams, they saw the figure again. Tall, faceless, always watching, sometimes stepping closer, sometimes fading into shadow. They could feel its gaze even in waking life, in city streets and suburban parks, as if it had followed them out of the woods. Over time, they learned that the lake area had a long history of disappearances and strange sightings. Hunters spoke of black humanoid shapes moving silently at night. Families recalled children hearing whispers calling from the trees. Old newspapers hinted at bodies found partially submerged in the lake, mutilated in ways that defied explanation. The cabin they had rented, supposedly abandoned, had a reputation locals never spoke of, except in hushed tones. The haunting never fully stopped. A few nights ago, Emma woke to the sound of tapping on her apartment window. At first, she thought it was a bird or the wind, but then she remembered the way it had felt in the cabin. Deliberate, calculated, and always watching. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. Luke, too, hears whispers sometimes, low voices just beyond comprehension when the house is quiet. They know it will never end, because some things once seen never stop watching, and sometimes the middle of nowhere is closer than you think. Story the end. The wind had a strange way of carrying sound across the empty plains, stretching every echo into something unfamiliar, something distorted. Out in the dead center of Nebraska, where the land rolled flat forever and the horizon felt like a lie, Caleb Rourke had lived his entire life. 30 miles from the nearest gas station, 50 from the nearest real town, and surrounded by nothing but abandoned farms, rusting silos, brittle weeds, and quiet that didn't feel natural. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that seemed to wait for something. Caleb's family had owned the Rourke homestead for 4 generations. The house was old, patched with new wood in some places and left sagging in others. Most people around here had moved away long ago, but his father refused. And when his parents died, his dad from a stroke, his mom of pneumonia, Caleb stayed too, partly out of obligation, but mostly because he didn't know anywhere else. Life was simple, if lonely. Fix the fence, repair the tractor, tend the livestock, check the windmill, call it a day. But in the last few years, something had started changing out on the property. Strange things. The kind of things Caleb tried to rationalize until he couldn't. The kind of things he didn't tell anyone because there was no one left to tell. It started with the livestock. One morning, Caleb found 2 of his cattle standing motionless in the field, sat their eyes wide and fixed on nothing. They were alive, but only barely. They didn't move when he waved his arms or shouted. They didn't blink. The vet said it looked like shock, but offered no explanation. A fox attack, maybe, or lightning. Caleb nodded, but he knew better. He'd seen lightning strikes before, and foxes didn't do whatever this was. A week later, he found the cattle lying in the same spot, perfectly intact but dead, with no marks and no sign of struggle, just dead. Their bodies were strangely cold, despite the warm morning. After that came the noises. Some nights, Caleb woke to the sound of footsteps outside the house. Slow, heavy steps circling the perimeter. He'd grab his rifle, throw open the door, and scan the yard, but nothing was ever there. The footsteps always stopped the instant he stepped outside. The wind would keep blowing, the plains stretching forever in all directions, and the silence would return like a smothering blanket. Then came the lights. A bright flash in the middle of the night, far out in the fields, no thunder, no storm, just light that flooded the windows for a split second, gone before his eyes fully adjusted. He tried convincing himself it was heat lightning or kids messing with him, but there were no kids within miles. He didn't really start to fear, not truly, until the night he found the old shed door wide open. That shed had been padlocked since his grandfather's time. Inside, he found tools scattered across the floor and what looked like deep, gouging scratches along the wooden walls, as though something had been trying to claw its way out instead of in. The next day, he padlocked it again, double chaining it for good measure. But 3 nights later, it happened again. Same thing. Same scratches, except more of them. He boarded it shut this time, hammering planks across the entrance until the entire shed was sealed. That held until the next week. When it happened the 3rd time, Caleb didn't even bother trying to repair it. He just stood there in the dark, staring at the broken boards scattered around the dirt, the padlock twisted apart like soft clay. Whatever was opening the shed wasn't human, or at least not anymore. He tried calling the sheriff, but the county had shrunk so much that the station only had 1 deputy, and he wasn't interested in driving miles into the middle of nowhere to examine scratches on a shed. Probably raccoons, he said, or a cougar. Caleb hung up without bothering to argue. Then came the day everything changed, the day he found the circle. It was early afternoon, and he had gone out to mend a section of fence on the southern edge of the property. The sun was high and sharp, the wind steady, everything normal. But when he crested the rise, he saw it. A perfect circle burned into the earth, 30 feet wide. The grass scorched to ash, the soil beneath baked into a dark, cracked pattern. Caleb stood at its edge, one boot hovering just above the blackened ground. Something deep inside him whispered not to step any closer. The circle was too perfect, too measured, too unnatural. And then he heard it, the faint hum coming from the ground. Low, steady, almost like electricity running through wires. Except there were no wires out here. Nothing but flat, empty plains. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the circle. The wind gusted hard enough to sting his face and ears, but the burned ground didn't move. No ash blew away. It was as if the fire that had made the circle had fused everything in place. Caleb went home that day with a sick, unsettled feeling in his chest. That night, the footsteps came again, louder, closer, heavy enough to rattle the porch. He gripped his rifle so tightly his hands hurt. He didn't open the door this time. He waited instead, breathing shallowly, listening as the steps circled the house again and again and again. Then came a slow, deliberate scrape against the siding, a dragging, metallic sound that made his skin crawl. like claws or metal or something in between. He sat there until dawn, not sleeping for even a moment. The next morning, he found the same strange footprints in the dirt, elongated, almost three-toed, sunk deep, as though whatever had made them weighed far more than any animal he knew of. The prints led from the circle in the field all the way up to his porch and then back into the plains, disappearing into the tall grass. That was the moment Caleb realized something wasn't just visiting the property. It was watching. And whatever it was getting closer. He tried to leave a few days later, packed a few bags, loaded the truck, and headed down the narrow road that cut through the plains toward the state highway. He drove fast, heart pounding, eyes scanning the fields. 10 miles down the road, the truck sputtered, coughed, lost power, dead. He got out and checked the engine, swearing under his breath. He could fix most things, but this made no sense. The battery was drained, completely. The wires were cold, not burnt, not chewed, cold, like someone had sucked the energy out of the whole system. He slammed the hood shut and looked around. Nothing. Just wind and grass. Then in the distance he saw it. Tall, thin, moving in the field. Caleb's breath hitched. The figure was walking slowly toward him. Too slowly. Its stride was unnatural, stilted, almost mechanical. It wasn't human. He knew that immediately. The proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, the shoulders too narrow, the head too smooth. He didn't wait to get a better look. He ran. Not to the house, not toward the figure. He sprinted across the road and into the wheat fields, ducking low, moving fast, heart pounding so hard he thought his chest might burst. The earth felt heavy beneath his boots, as if gravity itself had thickened. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed. When he finally stopped, the figure was gone. He stayed hidden in the fields for nearly 2 hours before he crept back to the road. His truck was there, untouched. The sun was starting to set. He didn't dare try to repair it. He walked the 10 miles home, constantly looking over his shoulder. By the time he reached the house, night had fallen. What happened next shattered the last pieces of Caleb's sense of safety. Around midnight, the lights in the house flickered, then died completely. He sat alone in the dark, listening to the wind batter the walls. Then the humming began, the same low vibration he'd heard in the circle. It grew louder, filling the house, vibrating through the floorboards. Pictures fell from the walls, a cup slid across the table. The entire structure trembled, and then, without warning, the humming stopped. Silence. A silence so complete it felt suffocating. Caleb stood in the middle of the living room, clutching his rifle, eyes darting to every window. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. He raised the rifle, hands shaking violently. The door creaked open a few inches. Cold air rushed in. Nothing stood in the doorway. Nothing he could see. But he felt it, felt something enter the house. The air shifted, heavy and electric. The hairs on his neck rose. His breath came out in a visible puff. Then, directly behind him, he heard slow, deliberate breathing. Deep. Inhuman. Wrong. Caleb spun, pulling the trigger, the blast shattering the darkness. The sound echoed for miles, but nothing was there. At least, nothing visible. The house shook again, harder this time, and the windows shattered inward. Glass rained across the floor. The lights flickered once, twice, then flared with a blinding white flash that knocked Caleb off his feet. When he came to, he was outside, lying in the dirt. The house was dark, silent, intact. The windows weren't broken, nothing was disturbed. His rifle was gone. He stood shakily, panic clawing at his throat. Then he saw them. Not one figure. 3, standing at the edge of the field, tall, thin, motionless, watching him. The humming started again. Louder. Louder. Filling his skull, filling the entire plain. Caleb screamed and ran blindly into the fields. He didn't know where he was going. Didn't care. He just ran until his body gave out. When he woke again, dawn was breaking. He was lying at the edge of the burned circle, the soil beneath him warm, his clothes singed. His truck was parked nearby, keys in the ignition, fully functional. He didn't remember how he got there. He didn't want to know. He got inside the truck and drove away. He didn't stop. Not for food, not for gas. Didn't go home, didn't tell anyone, didn't look back. He moved 3 states away, changed his number, sold the land from afar, told the realtor he never wanted updates, never wanted details. But on quiet nights when the wind stops suddenly and the air grows heavy, Caleb still hears that low humming in the back of his skull. And sometimes, far off in the dark, he sees tall, thin shadows standing completely still, waiting. Once, in the reflection of a window, he swore he saw one behind him. But when he turned, nothing was there. He keeps his curtains always closed now, sleeps with the lights on, watches the horizons with dread, because whatever he saw in the middle of nowhere didn't stay there, and he knows deep down that it's still looking for him, waiting for the quietest moment of his life. Story the end. The first time I heard about Cutter's Creek, I was sitting across from my uncle in a booth at a roadside bar off Highway 212. It was late, close to midnight, and the place was nearly empty except for a jukebox humming old country songs and a bartender flipping through a newspaper for the 10th time. My uncle, a retired trucker who'd spent half his life driving through forgotten corners of America, told me that if I ever had to travel through eastern Montana, I should avoid Cutter's Creek at all costs. Place ain't on any real map, he said, lighting a cigarette, even though the bar had a no smoking sign taped to the wall. People drive in and don't drive out. I laughed at the time, thinking he was exaggerating, spinning some tall tale to scare me. But the more he talked, the more a strange seriousness crept into his voice, something I'd never heard from him before, something almost like fear. You think I'm joking, he said, tapping ash into an empty beer bottle. But I seen things out there, things that ain't natural, stuff moving where nothing should move, lights in places with no electricity, faces watching you from trees that don't got no leaves. He leaned closer. And the worst thing is the sound, like whispering. But it ain't people whispering, it's the land itself. I didn't believe him then. I should have, because a year later, in the middle of a cross-country drive, I found myself going through that exact stretch of road. A storm had rolled in unexpectedly, the kind that turns the sky into a bruise and shakes the ground with thunder. My GPS kept trying to reroute me, insisting I exit onto a narrow, unpaved road that wasn't supposed to exist. I ignored it at first, but when traffic up ahead came to a standstill because of an overturned semi, I took the detour, just for a few miles, I told myself. Just long enough for the storm to calm. The road was nothing more than mud and gravel, the rain coming down so hard my wipers couldn't keep up. Trees rose on either side of me, strange-looking trees, tall and skeletal, their branches bare despite it being summer. The wind howled between them, making a sound I can still hear in my nightmares. Whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind pushing through the branches, but then it shifted. It took on a rhythm, a tone, almost like voices, low, drawn-out voices speaking words I couldn't make out. I should have turned back. Instead, I kept driving until I saw a sign, half-rotted and barely hanging on its post. The letters scratched so deeply into the wood, they looked carved by a blade. Cutter's Creek, 2 miles there, I froze. My uncle's warning hit me like a punch to the chest. People drive in and don't drive out, but the storm behind me was getting worse. Lightning cracked across the sky so bright it blinded me. Thunder followed instantly, shaking the steering wheel. I felt trapped between the storm and the unknown town ahead of me. If I stopped, I'd be stranded in the middle of nowhere. If I kept going, I drove forward. The road widened as I approached the town, the skeletal trees giving way to flat land dotted with small wooden houses. But something about them was wrong. They looked abandoned, windows boarded up or completely missing, doors hanging open like gaping mouths. The storm seemed to stop the moment I crossed into the town limits. The rain went from relentless pounding to a soft drizzle, and the wind died entirely. The sudden quiet felt unnatural, like stepping from chaos into a vacuum. My car sputtered, then died. I tried the ignition again and again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The dashboard lights flickered weakly, and then everything went dark. I sat in the silence for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, willing myself not to panic. That's when I heard it. A voice. A woman's voice. Right outside my car window. You shouldn't be here. I whipped my head toward the sound, but there was no one there. The street was empty. The houses were still. Even the air felt frozen. But then the whispering started again. Not from the trees this time, from the houses. I stepped out of my car slowly, the gravel crunching under my shoes sounding impossibly loud. I could feel eyes on me, though I saw nothing. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in the car, but I couldn't leave, not without help. A faint light flickered at the far end of the street. Not electric light, something softer, like a lantern. I followed it, telling myself that wherever there was light, there must be people. As I approached, I realized it wasn't a house at all, but an old general store with a sagging porch. A lantern hung from a rusty hook near the door, its flame strangely still despite the lingering breeze. I climbed the porch steps, each one groaning under my weight. When I pushed open the door, a bell tinkled overhead, but the sound was warped, stretched, wrong. Inside, the store looked like something preserved from the 1940s. Wooden shelves lined with dusty cans, jars, and boxes. A counter with a rusted cash register. A single figure standing with his back to me. An old man. His hair was long and white, his clothes ragged and faded. He didn't turn around when I entered, just spoke in a hoarse voice that cracked like dry wood. "You took the wrong road." "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My car broke down. I just need help. Maybe a tow or a phone." "There are no phones here." Something about the way he said it made my blood run cold. "Where am I?" I whispered. He finally turned to face me. His eyes were gone. Not closed, not damaged, just gone. Empty sockets, smooth and dark as if skin had grown over where eyes should have been. "You're in Cutter's Creek," he said, "and you need to leave before they know you're here." Before I could respond, the bell above the door tinkled again, this time loudly, violently, like someone had slammed into it. The old man's head snapped toward the sound. His voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "It's too late." The door creaked open behind me. I didn't turn around at first. I couldn't. Something about the air changed, like the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. My breath came out in a white mist. The store felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming toward me. The old man backed away, pressing himself against a shelf, cans rattling around him. He raised a shaking hand, pointing past me. "Don't look," he whispered. "Don't look at them." But something inside me, fear, instinct, stupidity, forced me to turn. And I saw it. A figure stood in the doorway, tall and twisted. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent the wrong way. Its face, if you could call it that, was nothing but stretched skin pulled tight over bone. No eyes, no nose, just an impossibly wide mouth curved into a smile that wasn't human. The creature took one step inside the store, and the boards beneath it groaned like they were screaming. Behind it, more figures gathered in the street. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Their bodies swaying in unison, whispering. The old man shouted, "Run!" I bolted through a back door I hadn't noticed before, bursting into an alley behind the store. The sky had darkened again, but it wasn't the storm this time. It was like the sun itself was being smothered. The air felt thick. Wrong. I sprinted toward the edge of town, but no matter how far I ran, the houses didn't change. The same boarded windows, the same broken fences, the same sagging roofs. It was like the town was looping around me, circling me, trapping me. The whispering grew louder, my vision blurred, the ground shifted beneath my feet. And then, silent. Silence. Complete silence. I woke up on the side of Highway 212, lying on the gravel shoulder as if I had collapsed there. My car was parked behind me, engine running, headlights on. The storm had passed. Cars were driving by as if nothing had happened. When I told the police what happened, they found no record of any town called Cutter's Creek. No road matching the one I described. Nothing at all in that area except open plains. I tried searching online. Again, nothing. But the thing is, sometimes at night, when the wind picks up, I can hear whispering outside my window. And in reflections, car windows, mirrors, puddles, I sometimes see trees that shouldn't be there. Skeletal trees. Watching me. Last week, something new happened. I found a note on my kitchen counter, written in jagged carved letters. "You did look." Underneath it was a handprint, long, twisted fingers, and no palm. I don't sleep anymore. I don't walk anywhere alone. And every time I close my eyes, I see that town, the looping road, the boarded houses, the lantern light. I hear the bell above the store door, and I know, they're still coming. Somewhere between the silence and the whispering, Cutter's Creek is waiting for me to wander too far again. And next time, I won't wake up on a highway. Story the end. It was the kind of small town you drove through without ever noticing it. A speck of asphalt and wood surrounded by endless cornfields and thick forests. For Ryan and his two friends, Alex and Jamie, it seemed like the perfect spot for a weekend camping trip. Quiet, secluded, far from cell service, and most importantly, away from anyone who might bother them. They had stumbled upon a map online, A hiker's blog describing a trail that led to an abandoned hunting lodge deep in the woods. The blog warned that the place had a strange energy, but the three of them laughed it off. By Friday afternoon, they were driving down a gravel road that narrowed so quickly the truck's tires seemed to swallow it whole. The trees leaned over the vehicle, brushing the roof with brittle, skeletal branches. Jamie, in the back seat, fiddled nervously with her camera. "Guys, are you sure this is even the right road? This doesn't feel right." "Relax," Ryan said, his hand gripping the wheel. "It's exactly what we're looking for. The more isolated, the better." Alex shrugged from the passenger seat. "I just hope there aren't bears, or worse, people." By the time they reached the trailhead, the sun was a pale disk behind clouds, casting long shadows that twisted the trees into grotesque shapes. The trail itself was overgrown, barely visible, and the forest seemed to swallow every sound except for the crunch of their boots. They laughed to cover the unease that had started to creep in. Hours into their hike, the lodge appeared through the trees. It was worse than they expected. Rotting planks, shattered windows, a roof sagging as if it were bowing to some unseen weight. The air around it smelled of damp wood and something sour, like old meat. The friends set up their tents in a small clearing nearby, keeping the lodge in sight but cautiously distant. As night fell, the forest became alive with strange noises. Twigs snapped in patterns that didn't make sense. Leaves rustled though there was no wind, and sometimes there was a low hum, almost like a chant carried on the breeze. Ryan tried to brush it off as his imagination. It's the forest, that's all. Wolves, owls, maybe hunters. But when the chanting grew louder and more distinct, Jamie froze. "It's saying something," she whispered. I think it's calling us." Alex laughed nervously. "It's probably an echo or something. Stop freaking yourself out." Still, neither of them could deny the creeping dread that slithered into their stomachs. They tried to sleep, but the noises didn't stop. Instead, they got closer, circling their tents, brushing against the fabric as if someone or something was walking just out of sight. At around midnight, Ryan woke to the sound of laughter, low and hollow, coming from the direction of the lodge. He nudged Alex, whispering, "Do you hear that?" Alex shook his head. "It's nothing. Go back to sleep." But Ryan couldn't. Something inside him compelled him to get up, to look. He grabbed a flashlight and cautiously walked toward the lodge. The trees parted like a tunnel, shadows stretching unnaturally. He could see movement inside, something shifting behind the broken windows. A figure, hunched and twitching, seemed to be pacing. It didn't move like a human. Too jerky, too deliberate, he froze, and then it turned its head toward him. No face, just a dark, featureless void where its eyes should have been. Ryan stumbled back, heart hammering. He tripped over a root, scrambling back to the tents. Jamie was awake now, trembling. "I saw it," she whispered. It came out of the lodge." Alex was trying to calm them, but even he looked pale. They decided to pack up and leave, their earlier bravado gone, replaced by raw fear. But when they returned to the truck, they found the keys gone, the doors locked from the inside. Nothing else in sight but the dark forest. Suddenly, there was movement in the trees behind them. Figures, dozens of them, thin, tall, faceless, emerged, moving in silence. They didn't run or walk. They glided. Ryan grabbed a large branch. Jamie screamed. Alex backed into the truck, frozen. The figures stopped a few feet away, their presence oppressive, the air thick with a cold that seemed unnatural. One of them raised an arm, or what passed for an arm, and a low, guttural noise echoed through the clearing. Ryan felt a pressure in his chest, like the world itself was pushing him down. He swung the branch, but it passed through nothing, as if the figures weren't entirely real. Panic took over. "Run," he yelled, and all three bolted into the forest, branches snapping, roots tearing at their feet. They ran for what felt like hours. The forest seemed endless, twisting back on itself. They could hear whispers now, hundreds of voices all saying their names, surrounding them. Every shadow looked like a figure, every rustle in the leaves like a hand reaching for them. They couldn't see the lodge anymore, but the forest itself had become the threat. Finally, they burst onto a gravel road, panting, bleeding from scratches, and saw headlights. A passing car stopped, the driver looking confused. They scrambled in, barely able to speak, telling the story in frantic bursts. The driver shook his head. "There's nothing out there. No lodge, no forest, just cornfields for miles. You three need to get checked out. Back in town, the police found the truck exactly where they said, but no sign of the lodge, the tents, or any footprints in the forest. Ryan, Alex, and Jamie tried to tell their friends, their families, anyone who would listen. But without proof, it became easy to dismiss as a shared hallucination, stress, or some kind of group psychosis. Months later, Ryan received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photograph, taken from somewhere high in the trees. It showed the three of them running through the forest that night. But in the shadows behind them, nearly invisible, were dozens of the tall, faceless figures, gliding silently, their dark forms stretching into the night. He showed it to Alex and Jamie. Their faces went pale. "We never took that," Jamie whispered. "No one did," Ryan said, voice shaking. "But they were watching, and I think they still are." Sometimes when he drives past small towns or thick forests, he swears he can see them in the shadows at the edges of vision, waiting, patient, ready. And he knows, without a doubt, that if he ever steps back into a forest like that, they'll be there, silent, faceless, and hungry for the terror they can create without ever touching a soul. Story the end. The sky was a dull gray the day I arrived at the cabin, nestled in the middle of a vast stretch of forest in northern Montana. My name's Tyler Hayes, and I was 28 at the time, working as a freelance photographer. I'd taken the assignment thinking it would be peaceful, documenting wildlife for a small nature magazine, but what I found instead was something I'll never forget. The road to the cabin was little more than a dirt track, winding through pine and spruce so dense that the sunlight barely touched the ground. My rental SUV struggled over potholes, and every so often, I'd hit a patch of mud that splashed up my windshield. By the time I arrived, I was covered in dirt and sweat. The cabin itself was small, rustic, and clearly abandoned for a while. Moss had started climbing the walls, the chimney leaned slightly to one side, and the windows were clouded with dust. I unpacked quickly and decided to explore the area. Behind the cabin, the forest opened into a meadow, and beyond that, the river glimmered faintly in the wan morning light. It was beautiful, quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. No traffic, no airplanes, nothing but birds, the river, and the wind through the trees. I set up my camera gear near the river, thinking I'd catch some shots of deer or maybe a fox. The first 2 days were uneventful. I followed the river upstream, documenting the subtle changes in foliage and the occasional animal tracks. At night, I'd cook by the wood stove and read by the faint glow of a lantern. The isolation was exhilarating at first, until I started noticing small things. It began with the noises. At first, I chalked it up to the forest settling. The way branches creaked, the wind rustled the leaves, or a branch would fall somewhere in the distance. But the night of the third day, I heard something different. A tapping sound, slow and deliberate, coming from the side of the cabin. Not loud, but rhythmic, like someone was testing the wood for weakness. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, shining it across the ground. Nothing. No footprints, no animal, nothing. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched only grew. I set up my camera near the back porch to catch movement at night. The first morning, I reviewed the footage. There was nothing until the last 10 seconds. A shadow passed quickly across the frame, far too tall and thin to be any deer or bear. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a tree branch, but a chill ran down my spine. By the fifth day, I began noticing other signs. My food was disturbed. The sugar container had tiny scratches on the lid, and a few cans had been shifted in the cupboard. At first, I assumed I was just being clumsy, leaving things out of place after a long day. But then I realized something. The footprints. Not animal prints, but human. Barefoot, large, leading from the edge of the forest toward the cabin and stopping abruptly at the porch. I considered leaving, but the river shots weren't going to take themselves, and I rationalized that maybe a local hunter had wandered too close. I didn't see anyone during the day, though, which was strange. Night 6 was worse. I woke to a scraping sound across the wooden floorboards in the cabin. At first, I thought it was the cat the owners had left behind for me, but Ruby, her name, as it turned out, was curled up at the foot of the bed. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it across the living room. Nothing moved, but the scratching continued, louder, like something was dragging itself across the floor. My heart pounded. I whispered her name, and she hissed. I spent the night in the living room, flashlight in one hand, hunting knife in the other. The scratching stopped at dawn. When I stepped outside, I saw footprints in the thin frost leading from the edge of the trees, circling the cabin once, then disappearing. The next day, I ventured further down the river than I had before. In a small clearing, I found a makeshift altar, stones piled into a rough circle, with feathers, scraps of cloth, and twigs arranged carefully inside. I felt my stomach drop. Someone had been here recently, and they had been watching me. I packed my equipment and returned to the cabin as fast as I could. That evening, I heard it again, tapping, scraping, and now a voice, whispering, soft and broken, "Go, now." I froze. The voice wasn't coming from the porch or the yard, but from inside the cabin. The door hadn't moved. The windows were shut. Ruby ran to the corner, hair standing on end. I turned on every light and prepared myself. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I decided to leave. I packed everything in a frenzy and loaded the SUV. As I started down the dirt road, I noticed something that made me slam the brakes. A figure standing at the edge of the forest. Tall, thin, barefoot, wearing tattered clothes that looked gray in the dawn. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and it just stood there, watching me. I floored the SUV and didn't look back. I called the owners as soon as I reached cell service. They told me no one had been on the property for months. Local authorities didn't take me seriously. They said I must have hallucinated due to stress and isolation. But I know what I saw. I know the footsteps, the altar, the whispering, and the way Ruby hissed at something invisible. I never went back to Dry Hollow. I don't know what was in that forest, but it wasn't human. And sometimes at night, when the wind carries just right through the trees near my house, I can still hear the tapping, scraping, and the faint whisper of a voice calling my name. Story the end. The road was nothing more than a cracked ribbon of asphalt winding through the forests of northern Maine. Josh and Claire had been driving for hours, hoping to reach a secluded cabin rented through a small online listing. The GPS barely worked. The cell signal was spotty, and by the time they reached the last turnoff, the sun was sinking behind dense pines, casting long, sinister shadows across the narrow road. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel path that twisted deeper into the woods. It looked innocent enough, small, wooden, with a stone chimney, but there was a weight to the place, a quiet that pressed down like a physical force. The air smelled damp and earthy, and the forest surrounding it was thick, almost suffocating. Inside, the cabin was functional. A small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and a single bedroom. Josh tried to brush off the uneasy feeling crawling over him. "It's just the woods," he said. "It's remote. That's the point." Claire nodded but didn't look convinced. She kept glancing at the windows as if expecting someone or something to be watching. Night fell quickly. They made a fire, ate a simple meal, and tried to relax. But the forest outside seemed to hum with life, though no wind stirred, no animals moved. Around midnight, a sound broke the silence. Faint tapping on the front door. Josh froze. "Probably a branch," he said, though the sound came in a rhythm, deliberate, almost mocking. The tapping continued, then shifted to the windows, circling the cabin like an invisible predator. Claire's hands trembled. "Josh, that's not a branch." They grabbed flashlights and peered outside, but the forest appeared still. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the beams of light. Shapes that weren't there a moment before seemed to creep along the edges of the trees. The tapping stopped abruptly. Then came the whispers, soft at first, unintelligible, but growing clearer. "Get out. Leave. We're watching." Josh and Claire tried to ignore it, convincing themselves it was the wind carrying strange echoes through the trees. But the whispers persisted, always just out of reach, surrounding the cabin. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the living room. Something, not quite human, glided along the wall, its limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Claire screamed, and Josh swung the flashlight, catching a glimpse of a pale face, elongated and featureless, watching them from the corner of the room. They ran to the car, hoping to escape, but the gravel path leading out of the woods seemed longer than it had been before. Trees leaned closer, their branches clawing at the car. Josh tried the ignition. It didn't start. Every attempt failed, the engine refusing to turn over. Then, from the darkness behind the car, the whispering voices grew louder, merging into a chilling chorus. "Stay with us." They ran back toward the cabin, desperate for safety inside. But the door they had locked earlier now hung open, splintered, and empty shadows poured in, moving independently of any natural laws. Figures, tall, thin, distorted, glided silently toward them, their movements impossible, their faces blank yet aware. Claire tripped and fell. Josh tried to lift her, but unseen hands seemed to press against him, holding him down. The shadows reached them, cold and suffocating, and the whispers became a deafening roar. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The shadows vanished. The cabin, the trees, the forest. It was quiet again. Josh looked around, panting, and Claire was gone. He ran, sprinting blindly through the woods until he found the highway. A lone truck passed, and he waved frantically. The driver stopped, staring in disbelief at his disheveled, terrified state. He tried to speak, but could only whisper, They're out there, in the woods. Authorities searched the area the next day. The cabin had vanished. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. The woods seemed to have swallowed everything, leaving only silence. Josh never spoke of that night in detail. He changed his phone number, left town, and avoided forests entirely. But he could still feel them, watching. In every shadow at the edge of his vision, in every whisper carried by the wind. Some nights, when the air is still, he can hear tapping at his windows, soft and deliberate like fingers brushing glass. And he knows, without doubt, that they're still out there, waiting for the next person to wander too far into the middle of nowhere. Story: the end. The road into Castle Valley wasn't much more than a strip of cracked asphalt fading into a ribbon of dirt. It cut between stretches of empty desert, low shrubs, and distant mesas shaped by wind and time. The nearest real town was over an hour away. Most people didn't even know the area had once been home to a tiny settlement, just a handful of ranch houses and trailers that families abandoned decades ago after the well ran dry and the cattle died off. Evan had grown up hearing rumors about the place from his grandfather, who'd worked as a sheriff's deputy in the region back in the 1980s. "Trouble out there," he used to say. "People go missing, and the desert swallows the rest." Evan had always assumed it was just dramatic storytelling. His grandfather had that flair. But after the old man passed away, Evan found an envelope hidden in one of his notebooks. Inside was a faded photograph of a boarded-up house, a hand-drawn map marking a spot labeled Coyote's Rest, and a handwritten note that made his skin prickle. "If you ever go looking, don't stay past sundown. And if you hear the knocking, don't answer." He shouldn't have gone. But curiosity, family mystery, and a little bit of grief pushed him to. Now he was 34, sitting in the driver's seat of his dusty Jeep, staring at the map and thinking maybe he should have listened. The desert was silent, too silent. Even the usual whine of insects felt absent. The wind brushed across the sand, whispering in a way that made Evan check his rearview mirror more than once. He finally reached the spot marked on the map. The house from the photograph stood alone at the edge of an old, dry ravine. Its wood was sun-bleached, the roof sagging, the windows boarded haphazardly. A shed leaned to one side like it had given up fighting gravity. Something about the place felt wrong. He stepped out, pulling his camera and notepad from the passenger seat. The heat wrapped around him instantly, the kind of dry, suffocating heat that made every breath feel heavier. "Should be quick," he muttered. "Just take a look. Maybe find whatever it is Grandpa wanted me to see." The porch groaned as he stepped onto it. The front door creaked, though it stayed shut. When Evan pushed it open, a wave of stale, dusty air hit him. The inside looked like someone had tried to leave in a hurry. An overturned chair, scattered papers, a broken lantern. He snapped a few pictures and walked deeper inside. The living room walls had deep scratch marks, like something had dragged claws along the wood. Evan paused, leaning closer. The grooves were long, uneven, too erratic to be from an animal. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. It didn't make sense. It was nearly 100 degrees outside. Yet here he was, rubbing his arms to chase away a chill. A faint thumping sound echoed through the hallway. Evan froze. It was soft, rhythmic. Knock, knock, knock. His grandfather's warning hit him like a punch. "If you hear the knocking, don't answer." Evan backed slowly into the living room, but the sound followed, louder now, coming from the back of the house. He knew he should leave, just get out, drive away, forget this entire place. But something tugged at him, a curiosity that overpowered fear. He made his way toward the hallway. The knocking stopped abruptly. A tense silence filled the air. Then a single, slow scrape. Something dragging across the floorboards. Something moving. Evan swallowed hard and gripped his flashlight. "Hello?" he whispered. No answer. When he reached the end of the hallway, he found a door partially open. Behind it was a basement staircase leading into darkness, so thick his flashlight barely pierced it. Against his better judgment, he descended. Each step groaned under his weight. Halfway down, his foot brushed something that rolled. He pointed the flashlight down and saw old glass bottles scattered across the stairs. Some were broken, glinting like teeth. The basement was bigger than he expected. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty jars, animal bones, feathers, pieces of rusted metal. A workbench sat in the corner, covered in tools and a thick, leather-bound journal. The journal's cover was cracked, the pages brittle. Evan flipped through it carefully. The handwriting changed several times, suggesting multiple people had used it over the years. But the entries all described the same thing. The Knocker. A desert legend. A creature that followed people who lingered too long, mimicking voices, tapping on walls, doors, windows. According to the journal, once someone heard the knocking inside their home, it meant the thing had already found them. Evan felt the hairs on his arms rise. He kept reading. One entry stood out. It hides in empty places. Can't stand the sun. Only comes out when shadows stretch long. It knocks to be let in. If you open the door, it takes your shape, leaves your skin in the sand. If you ignore it, sometimes it still comes. A cold breeze swept through the basement. But the door at the top of the stairs was still open. There was no wind down here. Then, knock, knock, knock. This time it came from the basement wall right beside him. Evan backed up so fast he nearly tripped. The knocking continued. Faster now. More frantic. Then the sound shifted, circling the basement, up high on the ceiling, then low along the floor. Something was moving around him. He bolted up the stairs and sprinted out of the house, fumbling for his keys. When he reached the Jeep, his hands shook so badly he dropped them twice. He managed to start the engine and drove down the dirt road as fast as he could without flipping the vehicle. He didn't stop until he saw the highway and the sun beginning to set behind him. He should have kept driving. He should have left the desert behind and never looked back. But he made one fatal mistake. He pulled into a gas station to calm down. The station was small, old, the kind that still had a bell that dinged when the door opened. The clerk looked up, a tired man maybe in his 40s. "Long drive?" he asked. "Yeah," Evan said, rubbing his forehead. I went out to that old settlement. My grandfather left something there." The clerk's expression changed instantly. His eyes narrowed. "You didn't stay long, did you?" "No, maybe an hour." "Did you hear it?" the man whispered. Evan's blood ran cold. "Hear? What?" "The knocking." Evan couldn't respond. The man closed the distance between them and lowered his voice. "If you heard it, then it followed you." "That's not possible," Evan argued, though the tremble in his voice betrayed him. The man leaned closer. "What'd you hear it knock on?" "The basement wall." The clerk swore under his breath. "If it found a wall, then it's already inside something. It'll follow you in the dark. Don't sleep tonight. Don't be anywhere quiet. Don't let it knock again. If it knocks 3 times, exactly 3. He hesitated. "You're marked." Evan left the station in a daze, the man's warning echoing in his ears. He drove until he reached a motel 30 miles away. It was run down but had cars in the parking lot. People, noise, lights. He checked into a room, turned on every lamp, TV, and fan. He ordered food just to have an excuse to open and close the door. He tried to stay awake, pacing anxiously. Around midnight, the TV flickered. The lights dimmed, the fan slowed, then stopped. Silence flooded the room. Thick and heavy. Knock, knock, knock. Evan's heart pounded so loud he felt dizzy. He backed into the corner, eyes wide, as the knocking came from the bathroom door. He tried to call the front desk, but his phone screen went black. The digital clock flashed once, then died. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate. The door handle began to turn. Evan ran outside, lungs burning, sprinting toward the front office. The night air was cold, too cold, and the shadows seemed to bend behind him. He banged on the office door until the clerk, a different man, younger, opened it. "Please, I need help. Something's in my room." Before he could finish, the bathroom door back in his room slammed open. Even from across the parking lot, He could hear it. Something stepping out, something dragging across the carpet. The clerk's eyes widened. Get inside, now. He pulled Evan in and locked the door. They backed away from the windows, huddled behind the counter. Minutes passed. The air felt wrong, thick with pressure. Then a single knock came from the office door. Soft, gentle, like someone asking to come in. The clerk shook his head violently. Don't move. Don't speak. Another knock. A third. Precise. Even 3 knocks. The clerk gripped Evan's arm so tightly it hurt. It's marked you. Evan's breath hitched. How do I get rid of it? You don't, the clerk whispered. You run, forever, if you have to, but you don't open the door. They waited in suffocating silence. After a long minute, the knocking stopped. The pressure eased. But when Evan finally gathered the courage to look out the small office window, he saw something standing at the far end of the parking lot. It looked exactly like him. Same clothes, same stance, same shaking hands, except its face was smooth, blank, skin stretched over nothing. The thing slowly lifted a hand and waved. Evan stumbled back, terror choking him. The clerk grabbed him again. It won't stop now, not until it wears you. Evan fled the motel before sunrise, leaving everything behind. Clothes, suitcase, car. He hitchhiked with a trucker who didn't ask questions. He reached a different state, then another. He kept moving. But every few nights when the world goes quiet, in motel rooms, in rest stops, in abandoned gas stations, he hears it. Knock, knock, knock. Sometimes far away, sometimes right beside him. He doesn't sleep much anymore. He doesn't stay anywhere long, because if he stays still, if he gives it silence, it'll catch up. It'll take the rest of him. And one day, someone might see a man who looks exactly like him, walking through some forgotten desert town, knocking on doors just after sunset. Story the end. The first thing Mark noticed when he stepped out of the truck was the silence. An unnatural, suffocating silence that didn't belong in the Nevada desert. Even the wind seemed to avoid that stretch of nowhere, as if afraid of brushing against the old, sun-bleached structures that marked the remnants of a once thriving mining town called Elkhorn Ridge. He had driven nearly 9 hours, leaving the lights of Las Vegas behind, following a string of back roads and abandoned service routes so weather-beaten they barely resembled roads at all. What was left of Elkhorn Ridge was little more than collapsed mine shafts, a decaying general store, and a scattering of cabins long overtaken by sand. But Mark wasn't there for the scenery. He was there because of his brother. 2 months earlier, his younger brother, Danny, had vanished during a solo photography trip. The sheriff's office had found Danny's truck parked at the end of the old mining road. His expensive camera lay smashed beside the driver's door, the lens shattered into glittering shards like diamonds under the desert sun. And the sand around the truck, smooth, undisturbed, no footprints, no tire marks, no signs of struggle, nothing. Mark refused to accept that Danny had simply walked off into the desert. He knew his brother better than that. Danny was cautious, prepared, and paranoid to a fault. If he had left that truck willingly, he would have left a trail. If he had been taken, there should have been evidence. But there was nothing, like he had evaporated. Now, Mark stood alone in the same spot, staring at the same dry horizon. The sun dipped low, the air cooling quickly. He should have stayed at the motel 30 miles back, but something had pulled him forward, an instinct he couldn't explain. He had brought camping gear, food, water, and a pistol he hoped to never use. He planned to stay the night, search the area at first light. He didn't plan on finding anything before then. But as he unpacked the truck, he heard something. A whistle, low, wavering, and unmistakably human, carried through the still air. It made his blood run cold because he knew that whistle. Danny used it every time they went hiking as kids. A 2-note tune, simple and dumb, but theirs. "Danny?" Mark called out before he could stop himself. Silence. Then the whistle again. Same notes, same tone. This time it came from the collapsed cabin near the mine entrance. Mark's lungs tightened. Logic screamed that it couldn't be Danny. But grief didn't listen to logic. He grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the sound. The cabin leaned crookedly, its roof half gone, its door splintered. The sun had nearly disappeared now, and shadows pooled in every broken corner. The whistle came again from inside. He raised his flashlight and stepped in. Dust filled the beam. The air smelled of dry rot and old earth. The interior was empty, except for a rusted cot and a broken chair. But as the flashlight swept across the far wall, Mark froze. Deep scratches marred the wood, long, jagged marks carved by something with strength far beyond that of a man, and next to the scratches, gouged into the wood with frantic, uneven strokes, was a word. Mark. The flashlight shook in his trembling hand. He backed away, stumbling over debris, his mind racing. Someone was messing with him. It had to be. Someone knew he'd come here. Someone wanted to scare him. Then the whistle came again. Behind him this time. Mark spun, flashlight jerking wildly, illuminating nothing but desert. His chest tightened. Without looking back, he returned to the truck, slammed the doors shut, and locked them. He sat there in the darkness, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The whistle came again, drifting across the dunes like a taunt. Mark didn't sleep. He waited for dawn. At daybreak, he forced himself out of the truck. In daylight, everything felt less malevolent. He almost convinced himself the whistle had been the wind, or his imagination, or some desert animal mimicking a sound. He headed toward the mine. The entrance was framed by decaying timber supports, old warning signs flapping in the morning breeze. Keep out. Danger. Collapse risk. No one had worked the mine since the 1950s. Locals said the last crew had quit overnight, refusing to speak about what had happened inside. Mark had read the stories while searching for clues about Danny, whispers of strange lights, inhuman voices echoing through empty shafts, and shadows that moved even when no one else was there. People went missing sometimes, all chalked up to the dangers of abandoned mines. But Mark didn't believe his brother died in some collapse. Something had led him deeper, and that same something was pulling Mark now. He turned on his flashlight and stepped inside. The temperature dropped instantly. The air felt thicker, like it clung to his skin. The beam of light cut through swirling dust. He moved deeper. Old mining equipment lay twisted and rusted, helmets, picks, broken rails, and footprints, fresh ones, leading forward. He crouched. They were small. Too small for an adult man, too small for Danny. Children. But what would children be doing here? His heartbeat sped up. He followed the tracks deeper into the labyrinth of tunnels until the walls tightened and the ceiling dropped. The prints ended abruptly, the sand smooth from that point onward. The tunnel widened again, opening into a cavern. Mark's breath caught. Hundreds of handprints covered the walls. Tiny, child-sized handprints pressed into the rock. Not painted. Not carved. Imprinted, as if burned in. He lifted his flashlight and his blood froze. Bodies, dozens of them, hanging from rusted hooks embedded in the wall. Desiccated, skin stretched thin over bone, mouths frozen open in silent screams. Their clothing, what little remained, looked decades old. Miners. Mark stumbled back, his stomach lurching. As he backed away, his light fell on something lying near the base of the wall. A camera. Danny's camera. He dropped to his knees and grabbed it with shaking hands. The casing was cracked, but the memory card was still intact. Hope surged through him. Then the cavern went quiet. Utterly, completely silent. The kind of silence that feels watched. The kind of silence that means you're not alone. Mark slowly turned. Something stood in the far end of the cavern. At first he thought it was a man, tall, thin, long-limbed. But the longer he stared, the more wrong the shape became. Its limbs were too long, too jointed, its head tilted as it examined him, its body hunched in unnatural angles, its skin pale as moonlight, stretched over what looked like twisted bone. Then it opened its mouth and emitted the whistle. Danny's whistle. 2 sharp notes. Perfect. Identical. Mark's scream died in his throat. The creature stepped forward. No sound, no hesitation, its limbs bending in ways the human body wasn't meant to move. Mark ran. He didn't look back. Didn't dare. His feet pounded through the tunnels, lungs burning. He tripped, scrambled, kept going, hearing nothing behind him but feeling its presence, cold and heavy, closing in. He burst out into the sunlight, nearly collapsing. He sprinted to the truck, threw himself inside, turned the key. The engine didn't start. He twisted again. Nothing. The whistle came from behind the truck. He turned slowly. Nothing there. He locked the doors, hands trembling violently. He reached for his phone. Still no service. He leaned back, trying to control his breathing, trying to think. A tapping sound came from the truck bed. Light. Deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Mark froze. The tapping shifted. Moving. Tap, tap, tap. Across the back window, he forced himself to look. A long, pale hand slowly pressed against the glass. Mark screamed, and that was the last thing anyone heard from Elkhorn Ridge for months. When rescue teams eventually found the truck, it was abandoned. The windshield was shattered from the inside. Mark's camping gear was missing, his pistol still inside. The ground around the truck was smooth, undisturbed, just like Danny's. But on the back window, smeared in dust by a trembling finger, was a single word: help. Rescuers searched the mine. They never found Mark, but they found his flashlight lying in the cavern, still on, still warm, and beside it a handprint in the rock, a large one. Not human, not even close. No one goes to Elkhorn Ridge anymore. Locals say the desert is changing there. The winds carry human whistles. The sand shifts in patterns like footprints forming and disappearing. Some nights under the thin desert moon, people swear they hear tapping on windows even miles away, and sometimes hikers claim to see someone standing alone in the dunes. Tall, thin, motionless, waiting. Story the end. I was 22, freshly graduated, and eager for adventure. I didn't grow up in the city. My life had been small towns, farms, and endless stretches of cornfields. So when I got the job delivering parts to rural clinics and farms across northern Nebraska, I thought it would be a dream, a chance to see the real country. I was wrong. It started on a Thursday. I had a delivery to make to a farm about 40 miles off Highway 81, a place called Red Pine Hollow, though no one in town seemed to use the name anymore. My GPS barely recognized the area, and the directions were vague. Turn left at the old silo, follow the gravel to the end of the creek. It sounded simple enough. By the time I reached the gravel road, it was late afternoon. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds that promised rain. The road narrowed until trees closed in on either side, forming a tunnel of branches. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked, but that peace didn't last. About 2 miles down the road, my truck's engine sputtered and died. Just like that, no warning, no sputter, nothing. I tried restarting, but the dashboard lights dimmed and flickered before going out completely. My phone had no signal. I was alone, miles from anything resembling a town or neighbor. I got out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. That's when I noticed something strange. Tire tracks that weren't mine, older, deeper, leading toward the edge of the trees. And then I heard it, a faint knocking sound. At first, I thought it was the truck shaking in the wind, but it didn't stop. It was steady, rhythmic, coming from the tree line. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the woods. Nothing. But then I thought I saw a shadow move between the trees. Tall, almost impossibly so. I squinted. My mind tried to rationalize it. A tree limb, maybe a deer, but the shape moved deliberately, shifting closer to the road. I decided to walk back toward the highway. The closer I got to the main road, the louder it became. Low, guttural growls mixed with whispers. They weren't human voices, not words, just sounds. Something alive, aware, watching. I found an old hunting cabin by the side of the road. Roof caved in, paint peeling, windows broken. I thought it might offer some refuge until the storm passed. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick, musty. I could smell decay, but there was no sign of animals. Just darkness. I shone my flashlight around and froze. Carved into the walls were words. Hundreds of them. Don't look. They see you. Never leave. Some were etched neatly, others jagged and frantic. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw them. Not human. Not animal. Tall figures, their limbs unnaturally long, heads too large, eyes black and empty. They didn't move immediately. Just stared, watching me with some unspoken awareness. I stumbled back, almost tripping over a broken chair, and they advanced. Slowly. I ran. Outside, the gravel road had shifted, or maybe I'd been turned around. But everything looked wrong. Trees were twisted in ways that defied nature, and shadows seemed longer than they should be, stretching toward me like they wanted to grab me. The whispers followed. They got louder, circling me, surrounding me. I found my truck eventually. The engine started immediately, like it had never died. But the road home was no longer the road I had come on. It twisted unnaturally, the trees forming walls on either side. The sky turned black, though the sun had just set. Every mile felt endless. That night, when I finally reached the highway, I thought I was safe. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw a figure on the roadside. Tall, thin, with glowing eyes. It didn't run or chase me. It just stood there, staring, as if marking me. I asked around town later about Red Pine Hollow. Locals avoided the subject, mumbling about old family farms that disappeared, people who went missing and were never found. Some said the hollow was cursed. Others didn't say anything at all. I left Nebraska shortly after, but the feeling didn't leave me. Sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I swear I see shadows in the corner of my eyes. Tall shapes that shouldn't exist, standing just beyond the trees, watching. I've learned to keep moving, never stopping too long, never looking too closely at the dark, because the hollow doesn't forget. It waits, and sometimes I think it's still following me. Story the end. The old highway out in eastern Montana was the kind of road that swallowed you whole. Miles of cracked asphalt stretched between endless fields of wheat, and beyond that, nothing but sky. No towns, no lights, no signs of life except for the occasional abandoned barn or rusted-out grain silo. This was where Dean Whitaker found himself one late October evening, driving back from a hunting trip with nothing but the moon and the weak glow of his headlights to guide him. Dean was used to the isolation. He had grown up here, on a small ranch his grandfather built decades earlier. His parents had died when he was 19, leaving him the land. He'd never minded the solitude until that night. The trouble started as a simple detour. Dean's truck hit a patch of rough road, and he saw a small sign for an old county road that wasn't on any map. Curiosity, or maybe just boredom, nudged him off the highway. He turned, following the thin strip of asphalt, into what quickly became an overgrown, twisting path between trees that seemed too close together. At first it was peaceful, the crunch of his tires on gravel, the smell of wet earth, the faint hoot of an owl in the distance. But then he noticed the signs. First, the abandoned car at the side of the road, doors wide open as though the occupants had vanished. Rusted, old, probably decades old, but there was a fresh set of tire tracks leading up to it. Dean paused, uneasy. He drove on. The trees grew taller, denser, shadows pressed close, twisting in the headlights. That's when he noticed the figures. At first, he thought it was animals, deer maybe, standing still in the road ahead. But the figures weren't deer. They were human-shaped, thin, unnaturally thin, with pale faces that reflected the headlights in a way that made him flinch. He slowed the truck, heart hammering. The figures didn't move, just stood there, staring, until he passed. The moment he was gone, he could swear they shifted, moving just slightly, but impossible to tell if it was real or his imagination. Then came the smell. Rot. Acidic, metallic rot that made his stomach churn. It filled the cabin of the truck, thick and choking. He rolled up the windows and turned on the heat, but it clung to the air, clung to his skin. He glanced in the rearview mirror. There were more figures now, not just by the side of the road, but in the fields, lining the edges like sentinels. They were all staring, watching, and then, as if he had broken some unspoken rule, they started moving toward him. Dean floored the accelerator. The truck shuddered over the uneven road, tires kicking up rocks. He didn't look back, but he could feel them closing in. The smell intensified, filling his nose, burning his eyes, and then silence. The road ended abruptly in a clearing. A single decrepit farmhouse sat there, lit faintly by an unseen source. No smoke, no lights from windows, just the soft glow of something unnatural. His truck stalled as he came to the edge of the clearing. Dead. No engine, no lights, nothing. He stepped out, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. The smell of rot was stronger here, and then he heard it. A low, dragging sound from the house. Something scraping across the floor, slow and deliberate. Dean approached cautiously. The front door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open with his foot. The smell hit him full force inside. Inside, the house was empty. No furniture, no debris, just dirt, dust, and the lingering stench of decay. But on the walls were marks, deep and dark, like fingernails had scraped across the plaster. Something whispered. Dean spun. The house was empty, but the whisper came again. Closer, right behind him. He swung around, flashlight sweeping the room. Nothing. Then he felt it. A cold pressure on his shoulder, like a hand, but no one was there. He ran, out the back door, across the yard. Something was behind him, moving fast, silent but enormous. Dean didn't dare look. He dove into the nearest woods, scrambling over roots, cutting his hands and face on branches. Behind him, the whispering continued. Low, hissing, almost like laughter. He didn't stop until he stumbled back onto the county miles from where he'd started. His truck was gone. Tyre's tracks led away into the trees and disappeared. Dean hitchhiked back to town at first light, covered in blood and scratches, trembling. He reported the incident, but the deputies laughed him off. No roads, no farmhouse, no tracks, just an abandoned stretch of county road. He tried to return weeks later with friends, cameras, GPS. None of it mattered. The road vanished into fields. The farmhouse wasn't there, not even a trace of it. Years later, Dean avoids the area entirely. He's moved into town, works in a shop, tries to tell himself it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But sometimes, late at night, he hears scratching outside his window. Low, deliberate. Sometimes he wakes to find shadows at the edge of his vision, tall, thin figures that vanish when he turns. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, he catches the faint smell of rot, metallic and sharp, and he knows he was never meant to leave that place. Story, the end. The town of Clover Ridge, Wyoming, was the kind of place most people only drove through. A few hundred residents, 2 gas stations, a diner, and miles of nothing but open prairie and jagged hills. Outsiders rarely stayed, and those who did often left in a hurry, though no one spoke about why. The locals had stories that were considered warnings disguised as tales, but newcomers never listened until it was too late. Mark and Jenna were new to the area, moving from Denver to take over an old ranch on the edge of town. They had dreamed of wide-open spaces, quiet nights, and star-filled skies. What they didn't expect was the oppressive sense of isolation, the feeling that the land itself was watching them. The first night in the ranch, everything seemed normal. The house creaked in the wind, the stove rattled, and the dogs barked at shadows outside. But when Mark went outside to inspect the barn, he noticed tire tracks in the dirt, tracks that weren't his. They were wide, deep, and led straight into the field behind the barn, stopping abruptly near the tree line. Probably just some locals, Mark told Jenna later, trying to calm himself, but Jenna didn't look convinced. She had an uneasy feeling she couldn't shake. A few nights later, they were awakened by the sound of footsteps outside their bedroom window. Mark went to check and saw nothing at first. Then he noticed a shadow moving among the trees, shifting too smoothly, too deliberately to be an animal. He grabbed a flashlight, but when he shone it, the shadow was gone. The dogs were growling, low and menacing, their hackles raised. Over the next week, the incidents increased. Doors that had been locked were found unlocked. Windows that had been shut tight were open, sometimes with small, muddy footprints leading away from them. And always, the feeling of being watched. One evening, Jenna found something in the driveway, a black hooded cloak draped over a fence post. There was no one around and no footprints leading to it. Inside the cloak was a note, jaggedly written in red ink, "We see you. Don't leave." They called the sheriff, a tall, wiry man named Harris, who came out but found nothing. "You're on the edge of nowhere," he said. "People get jumpy out here. Wind can move things. Animals get into your stuff. Don't read too much into it." But neither Mark nor Jenna felt reassured. A week later, the power went out. Not a normal outage. The lines were intact. The transformer was fine. That night, the whispers began, low rasping coming from the corners of the house. Sometimes they called Jenna's name, sometimes Mark's. But neither could locate the source. The dogs refused to leave the bedroom. Mark set up a few cameras outside, hoping to catch whoever or whatever was doing this. The next morning, the footage chilled him to the bone. The cameras showed a figure standing just beyond the tree line, tall and thin, face obscured by shadows, not moving for hours. Then the figure slowly walked toward the barn, bending unnaturally at the joints, almost crawling upright. And when it reached the barn, it stopped and looked directly at the camera. After that, they began finding messages in the house, carved into walls, written in dirt on the floors. "Leave now, alone forever, we know." Sometimes it appeared overnight, sometimes during the day. No pattern. One night, Mark woke to find Jenna missing. The bedroom door was ajar. The dogs were nowhere to be found. The window was open, muddy footprints leading toward the woods behind the house. He ran outside, flashlights sweeping the tree line. The only thing visible was the hooded figure, standing perfectly still, just beyond the tree line, watching. He called the sheriff again, frantic, but this time, even the deputies couldn't find anything. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no Jenna, only the quiet stretching endlessly across the prairie. Mark stayed at the ranch, though he rarely slept. The cameras continued to show the figure appearing nightly, sometimes standing at the edge of the barn, sometimes at the back door, always watching. The messages continued. More aggressive now. Stay or join her. Months passed. Mark's health declined. He stopped answering the few phone calls he received. People in town eventually assumed he had left, but his truck remained, rusting in the driveway. Occasionally, travelers driving through reported seeing a lone figure wandering the property, always hooded, always watching from a distance. Some nights, when the wind blew across the plains, neighbors say they can hear whispers, calling names, calling for someone, anyone, to answer. And if you get too close to the old ranch, you might see the figure in the tree line, tall, thin, and patient, waiting for the next person foolish enough to wander too far from the road. The locals no longer speak Mark or Jenna's names. They only warn outsiders. Stay on the highway. Don't go near the ranch. Some things are better left alone. The ranch stands empty, though the wind carries the faint sound of footsteps and whispers that don't belong to the living. And sometimes, if you drive past at night, you might see a figure, hooded and still standing at the edge of the property, staring at nothing and everything. Story the end. The highway had been empty for miles, stretching straight into the Montana plains, with nothing on either side except the occasional ranch or wind-bent tree. Cole was driving, his cousin Jared riding shotgun, and his girlfriend Mia in the back. They were headed to a remote hunting lodge that Cole's uncle owned, tucked deep in the Bitterroot Mountains. The kind of place where the GPS signal died halfway through the valley and the cell tower hadn't been built since the 90s. It was late afternoon, the sun low and fiery orange, casting long shadows across the road. Cole laughed at Jared's nervous jokes about mountain ghosts. "It's just a cabin in the woods, not some haunted horror movie set," he said. But the road didn't stay simple. Gravel replaced asphalt, then barely a track in the dirt. Patches of snow from early winter lined the edges, and the forest on either side grew thick, dark, and impossibly silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. "That's a lot darker than I expected," Mia murmured, peering out the window. Jared shivered. "Yeah, feels like something's watching us." Cole rolled his eyes, but unease settled in his chest. The trees seemed to crowd closer together, and the road twisted unexpectedly. Somewhere in the distance he thought he saw a figure, tall, hunched, standing among the pines, but when he blinked, it was gone. By the time they reached the lodge, the sun had vanished completely, leaving only the cold glow of twilight. The cabin was bigger than Cole remembered. A 2-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch, stacked firewood, and a chimney that had long been unused. The windows reflected the darkening forest like black mirrors. Inside, the air was musty, smelling of old wood and pine needles. The furniture was covered in sheets, and cobwebs hung in corners like delicate lace. Cole tried to start a fire, but the lighter wouldn't work. "Maybe the wind's too strong," he muttered. As they unpacked, a subtle sound came from outside, a faint tapping like a branch brushing against the porch railing. Cole went to the window. Nothing. Just shadows moving with the wind. Later that night, as they sat around the fireplace finally lit, the tapping returned. But now it was rhythmic. Tap, 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 coming from the back of the cabin. "Maybe a raccoon?" Jared suggested nervously, but his voice lacked conviction. The tapping didn't stop. It came closer, louder, circling the cabin. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence. Too complete, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Hours passed. Cole and Jared fell asleep on the couches, Mia in the loft. Around 3 a.m., she woke to a whisper. Low, almost inaudible, but unmistakably a voice. "Mia." She froze. Her pulse hammered in her ears. The voice called again. "Mia." She got up quietly, trying to convince herself it was a dream, but the whispering grew coming from the hallway. She crept toward the stairs and peeked down. The cabin was empty, or so she thought. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Tall, impossibly thin, limbs bent at strange angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, reflecting the dim firelight like wax. Its face, it had none. Just a smooth, featureless plane where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Mia stumbled back, gasping, and screamed. The sound woke Cole and Jared. They ran to her side, but when they flicked on the lights, the figure was gone. The three huddled together, trying to rationalize it, maybe sleep paralysis, maybe stress, but deep down they knew what they had seen. They decided to leave at first light. Cole started the truck, but the engine coughed and died. He tried again. Nothing. The forest was eerily silent. And then they saw it. Shadows between the trees, dozens of them, gliding silently, circling the cabin like vultures. Panic set in. Cole grabbed a rifle from the lodge, checking the chambers, but the shadows didn't react. They didn't need to. They just watched. Suddenly, a sound came from the porch, the front door rattling like someone or something was trying to get in. Tap, tap, matching the rhythm from earlier. Jared whispered, "Don't open it." But curiosity, or madness, made Cole peek through the window. The figure was there, face still blank, head tilting unnaturally, limbs bending in ways no human should. Its hand, if it could be called that, tapped insistently. Something deep in Cole's mind screamed. He slammed the window shut, and the shadows outside recoiled slightly. But they didn't leave. They spent the rest of the night barricaded inside, listening to the scraping, the tapping, the soft whisper of their names carried on the cold wind. Every time they dozed off, the whisper would wake them. By dawn, the shadows had vanished, and the cold morning sun gave the forest a peaceful, almost forgiving look. Cole tried the truck again. It started. They didn't speak on the drive back, eyes glued to the road. Weeks later, Cole received a package with no return address. Inside was a small black pebble, smooth and warm. On it, carved so fine it looked almost impossible, their initials. That night, tap, tap, tap came from the window. No one believed them. But every night, Cole dreams of the figure, the shadows, the way the forest watches and waits. He knows it's patient, waiting, and it will find them again. Story the end. It was late September when Logan and his friends, Tyler and Cassie, decided to escape the city for a weekend in the mountains of northern Idaho. They had rented a small, isolated cabin someone had recommended online. No neighbors, no distractions, pure wilderness, the listing had promised. Perfect, they thought, for hiking, fishing, and disconnecting. The drive took hours. The paved roads ended abruptly, giving way to a narrow dirt track that twisted through thick pine forests. Cell signal disappeared quickly, leaving them reliant on paper maps and instincts. The sun hung low in the sky, streaking the trees with orange light that made the shadows feel alive. "Why did it have to get dark so fast?" Cassie complained from the back seat. "Relax. It's just a cabin in the woods," Logan said, though even he felt uneasy. Something about the forest seemed deliberate, like it was watching them. When they arrived, the cabin sat on the edge of a steep hill, overlooking a small creek below. It was old but solid, logs blackened by time, a crooked chimney, windows covered in grime. They parked and unloaded their bags, the crunch of gravel loud in the stillness. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and damp wood. Cobwebs clung to corners. The furniture was sparse, a table, a few chairs, a couch, and a bed with a thin mattress. The electricity worked, barely, flickering lights making shadows dance across the walls. That night, they sat around the fireplace, the wind rattling the windows. Tyler tried to lighten the mood. "It's perfect out here. Quiet. No one to bother us. Just us." Cassie shivered. "Yeah, too quiet." They went to bed early, but Logan couldn't sleep. The forest pressed in against the cabin like a living wall. Around midnight, he heard it, a tapping at the window. Slow, deliberate. He froze. "Tapping?" Tyler muttered, half asleep. "Yeah, someone's outside," Logan whispered. They waited in silence. Tap, tap, tap. It continued, rhythmic, almost intelligent. Logan's stomach churned. No human would tap like that, not out here. Tyler grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but the beam revealed only the forest, dark, endless, empty. The next morning, they decided to hike a trail that led to a small waterfall. The forest was thick, the trail barely visible, roots and rocks making the footing treacherous. Logan noticed tracks in the dirt, large, uneven, with long toes. Not deer, not bear. Something else. By mid-afternoon, the trail opened to a clearing. In the center was a circle of stones, arranged deliberately with branches and bones laid in strange patterns. Logan stepped closer, heart pounding. "Do you see this?" he asked. Tyler nodded, pale. "It's like a ritual." Cassie's face went white. "We shouldn't be here." The air shifted. The forest seemed to hold its breath. And then he heard it. A whisper. His name. Logan. He spun around. No one. But the whisper repeated, soft, insistent. "Logan." They ran back toward the cabin, the shadows between the trees moving unnaturally fast. When they reached it, the door was ajar. They hadn't left it open. Inside, the temperature had dropped. Frost formed on the edges of the windows. The furniture had shifted. The circle of stones from the clearing had appeared in the middle of the floor, rearranged perfectly. Then, from the corner of the room, they saw it. Tall, thin, limbs bent at impossible angles. Its face was blank, smooth, but its presence radiated intelligence. It tilted its head, watching them. They bolted, grabbing what they could, and ran into the forest. The creature followed, gliding silently between the trees. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified. They tripped over roots, crashing through underbrush, but they didn't dare stop. Hours later, exhausted, they stumbled onto the dirt road, only to find their truck missing. In its place, the tires had sunk into the earth as if the vehicle had never been there. The forest seemed to close around them, swallowing the road behind them. A single sound echoed from the trees. Tap, tap. They ran until dawn, finally reaching a ranger station. Authorities found nothing when they investigated. The cabin was abandoned, no tracks, no circle of stones, nothing. Even the dirt road looked unused, as if no one had driven it in decades. But Logan, Tyler, and Cassie know what they saw. Every so often, when Logan is home alone, he hears tapping at his window at night. Slow, deliberate, intelligent, and sometimes a whisper, "Logan." No matter how far he moves, how many towns he crosses, he feels it watching, waiting, patient. One night, he glimpsed something in the corner of his living room, tall, thin, featureless, perfectly still. Then it vanished, and he knows it will return. Story the end. The highway stretched endlessly, straight and empty, cutting through the vast Nebraska plains like a scar. Emily and her friends, Tyler and Rachel, had decided on a spontaneous weekend road trip, leaving Omaha behind to explore the forgotten towns along the state's backroads. GPS was spotty, cell service unreliable, but that was part of the thrill. No motels, no crowds, just them and the open road. By late afternoon, the trio found themselves near a place called Blackwater. It wasn't on most maps, only a small dot with a barely visible road branching off into the fields. The town was almost completely abandoned, with only a few dilapidated houses and a boarded-up general store. Wind whipped across the empty streets, carrying the scent of dust and decay. Emily's stomach churned at the eerie silence. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned the area. "Let's check it out," Tyler said, grinning, trying to shake off the creeping unease. The first house they explored was small, wooden, and tilted slightly to one side. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust. Furniture was overturned, cobwebs draped the corners like ragged curtains. But what unsettled Emily the most were the walls. Scrawled across the plaster in dark, jagged letters were words she couldn't ignore. "Stay out." "They watch." Rachel laughed nervously. Probably kids playing a prank ages ago. But Emily didn't laugh. Her gut screamed otherwise. They decided to move on, heading to what remained of the general store. The door creaked as Tyler pushed it open. Shelves were mostly bare, except for a few cans rusted beyond recognition. The floorboards groaned under their weight, and the shadows inside seemed to stretch unnaturally as the sun dipped lower. That's when they heard it, a soft whisper, almost imperceptible. "Leave." Emily froze. Tyler looked around, frowning. "Did you hear that?" The whisper came again, this time slightly louder, echoing off the empty walls. "Leave. Now." Suddenly, a heavy banging shook the storefront windows. Something outside. Something large. Emily's heart pounded. Tyler grabbed a flashlight and shone it out the cracked glass. Nothing, just the empty street. But the feeling of being watched intensified, pressing against them from every dark corner. They tried to leave, but as they stepped outside, the wind died. The air was oppressively still. And then Emily saw movement, figures in the distance, just beyond the row of abandoned houses. They were tall, thin, and moved slowly, unnaturally. Not running, not walking, but gliding. They stopped when Emily blinked, freezing in place. "Tyler, Rachel, do you see them?" Emily whispered. Neither answered. Their faces had gone pale. Before Emily could react, the figures began advancing, moving faster than they should have been able to, silently, without making a sound. Panic surged through the group. They ran toward the car, but the engine wouldn't start. Every door and window they tried was locked, though they had the keys. And then the whispers began again, multiple voices overlapping, coming from all directions. "You shouldn't be here." The shadows closed in. Emily turned her flashlight on them. The beam revealed grotesque, elongated faces, eyes black as coal, mouths stretched into unnatural grins, limbs bent the wrong way. Not human, but terrifyingly intelligent. Watching, waiting. Rachel screamed. Tyler tried to grab her, but she was yanked backward, the shadows folding around her like smoke. Emily ran, stumbling over broken boards, tripping through weeds taller than her knees. She could hear Rachel's cries fading, replaced by a guttural, inhuman growl. Emily reached the edge of the town, finally finding a break in the figure's pursuit. She sprinted toward the highway, adrenaline pushing her forward. She didn't stop until the asphalt cracked under her feet, and the first headlights of a passing truck illuminated her pale, terrified face. The driver slammed on the brakes, staring at her with disbelief. Emily tried to speak, but could only choke out, they're in Blackwater. The authorities returned with her the next day. The town was empty, not a single figure, not a whisper, not a trace of her friends. Houses that had been standing the day before were now in ruins, as if decades had passed in hours. The general store was gone, replaced by a field of scorched earth. Emily never returned to the plains. She couldn't explain what happened, couldn't find any logical reason why a town could disappear, or why something had taken her friends. When she researched Blackwater later, she found only vague references in old newspaper clippings, a town that vanished from records, people who disappeared into thin air over the decades. Locals whispered that Blackwater was cursed, a place where the line between reality and something else was dangerously thin. Even now, years later, Emily refuses to drive past that stretch of road. Some nights, when the wind is right, she swears she hears whispers outside her window, soft and taunting. And sometimes, in her dreams, she sees the gliding figures again, watching, waiting, their elongated faces grinning as if they've been patient all this time. Because some places in the middle of nowhere aren't abandoned. They're alive. Story the end. It was late September when I accepted the job. I had been working as a maintenance tech for a utility company, but this one assignment promised isolation and a decent paycheck. I was to inspect a series of power lines and poles deep in the woods of northern Maine, an area so remote the company's GPS coordinates barely registered on Google Maps. I arrived late afternoon. The sky was gray, low clouds pressing down like a heavy blanket. The forest was dense, thick with pine and spruce, the kind of woods where sunlight barely touches the ground. I parked my truck near the first set of poles and unloaded my equipment: harnesses, ropes, tools, and a small generator. The plan was simple: check each pole, record any damage, repair if necessary, and move on. It should have been straightforward. By the time I reached the second pole, the wind had picked up. The trees groaned under it, their long branches swaying like something alive. I climbed the pole, checking the insulators and wiring. Everything looked fine. That's when I noticed something strange: footprints in the mud below. They weren't mine. Or rather, they weren't made by any animal I recognized. They were too large, too elongated, like someone or something had walked on tiptoe. I froze, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just the wind and the darkening forest. I shook it off. Probably a hunter or another worker, I told myself. I packed up and moved to the next pole, but the unease didn't leave me. By late evening, I reached the farthest pole. My truck was barely visible through the trees, the generator casting a weak glow. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural hum coming from deeper in the woods. It wasn't like any animal sound I had ever heard. It rose and fell in pitch, almost like breathing or whispering. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence. I started back toward my truck, flashlight cutting through the underbrush. That's when I saw them, shapes between the trees. Tall, impossibly thin, their limbs bent at wrong angles. They didn't move like humans. They didn't run or walk. They glided as if the ground was beneath them, but not really. My heart raced. I shouted and waved my flashlight, but they didn't retreat. They simply stopped, watching. I ran, tripping over roots, falling into the mud, scrambling back to the truck. When I finally got inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. The moment I turned the key, all the shapes disappeared. The forest looked empty, silent. I drove without looking back, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. The woods seemed alive, shadows shifting just out of my line of sight. When I reached the highway, relief washed over me. But even there, I felt it. The gaze of something patient, waiting. Later, I learned the area had a dark history. Locals told stories of people disappearing in those woods for decades. Hikers, hunters, utility workers, all vanished without a trace. Some spoke of the Tall Ones, creatures that watched from the tree line, waiting for anyone foolish enough to wander too far. I quit the job the next day. But the memories didn't leave me. Sometimes at night, when the wind rattles my window, I hear whispers. Sometimes I see a shadow in the corner of the room, thin and impossibly tall. I've moved 3 times since then, but I can still feel them following, always just out of sight. I don't know what they are or why they watch. All I know is this: the woods are patient and they never forget. Story the end. The sky was bruised purple as the last remnants of the sun sank behind the dense Montana hills. Kyle and his friends, Sarah and Ben, had been driving for hours, seeking solitude for a weekend camping trip far from any town or highway. They had no cell service, only an old paper map and their supplies. The road was narrow, winding, and lined with thick pine that blocked out the fading light. They found the turnoff that led to the campsite late in the afternoon. The path was little more than ruts in the dirt, overgrown with weeds and flanked by towering trees that pressed together above like a natural tunnel. By the time they reached the clearing near the small lake, night had nearly fallen. Their campsite was basic: a small clearing, a fire ring made of rocks, and a few scattered logs. But there was an eerie stillness about the place. No insects, no rustling leaves, no bird calls. The kind of silence that felt wrong. They set up their tents quickly. Kyle started a fire while Sarah and Ben unpacked supplies. Shadows from the trees danced in the firelight, and every crackle of the flames sounded amplified in the quiet night. Around midnight, Kyle heard it first, a low, dragging sound coming from the woods. He froze, straining to hear over the fire crackle. Sarah and Ben looked up from their blankets. "What is that?" Sarah whispered. "I don't know," Kyle said, forcing calm. "Probably an animal. Deer, maybe a coyote." But then they heard the second sound, soft, deliberate footsteps in the dirt outside the clearing. 3 distinct steps, then a pause, then 3 more. The sound didn't move randomly. It circled the campsite, moving in a way that suggested it was watching them. Ben grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the edge of the trees. The beam caught nothing at first, then a figure, tall, unnaturally thin, pale, emerged for a brief moment before retreating into the darkness. Its movements were fluid and wrong, limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The friends backed away toward the tents, panic rising. The figure didn't make a sound, but the sensation of being observed was suffocating. They packed up as quickly as possible and tried to start the car. The engine turned over, but the headlights flickered and died immediately. And then came the whispers. Soft, sibilant, coming from all directions at once. "Leave, leave. Stay with us." They ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches scratching faces and arms, hearts hammering. Behind them, the whispers rose in intensity, and the dragging sound followed, faster now, almost gliding through the forest. Kyle tripped, hitting his head on a root. When he looked up, Sarah was gone, and Ben was being pulled backward by something dark and featureless. Kyle scrambled to his feet and ran blindly, adrenaline propelling him. He reached a ridge and saw the distant glow of a highway. Sprinting the last few hundred yards, he collapsed onto the asphalt. Passing cars honked, stopping as they saw his pale, mud-streaked face. He tried to explain, but no one could comprehend. When authorities went to investigate the campsite the next day, there was nothing. No footprints, no tire marks, no sign of struggle. Even the lake was calm and pristine, as if no one had been there. The trees seemed older, denser, almost as if the forest had reasserted itself overnight. Sarah and Ben were never found. Kyle moved away from Montana. He never camped again, never traveled alone, never ignored the feeling of being watched. On quiet nights, he hears whispers in the wind, indistinct but persistent. Sometimes he dreams of thin figures, pale and featureless, standing at the edge of forests, waiting patiently for the next intruder. He knows now that some places in the middle of nowhere aren't empty, they're alive, and they never forget. Story the end. The county road was nothing more than a cracked strip of asphalt cutting through the barren Wyoming basin, a place where the land stretched so far and so empty that the horizon felt like a wall. The wind carried dust like a ghost trail, grit rubbing against the skin, and the nearest town was 70 miles in any direction. There were no trees, no houses, no lights. Just sagebrush, the occasional tumbleweed, and the ceaseless hum of the wind. Mark Jensen had driven this road dozens of times while hauling equipment between oil sites. It was lonely, sure, but he liked the isolation. He liked the feeling of being irrelevant out there, swallowed by the vast, open nothing. But on this particular night, he wished for anything to break the silence. His radio had died 2 hours ago, and the sun had set fast, leaving him alone with the truck's headlights carving weak beams into the desert dark. He was halfway through a long stretch of emptiness when he saw the first sign something wasn't right. A man stood on the side of the road. No car, no bag, no indication of how he'd come to exist in the middle of nowhere. Mark slowed, then stopped. It was the natural thing to do. You find someone stranded on a road like that, you help. But as soon as the truck rolled to a stop, a shiver crawled up his spine. The man hadn't waved. He hadn't flagged him down. He just stood there, staring directly at the truck. Mark leaned over and rolled down the passenger window. "Hey, you all right?" The man didn't move. He was tall, with long limbs and clothes that looked too thin for the cold night. Just a white button-down shirt and black slacks, like someone who'd stepped out of an office building thousands of miles from where he should be. His skin was pale, almost gray under the headlights. "You lost?" Mark asked. The man tilted his head slightly, but not like a person trying to understand something, more like a bird observing prey. Then he smiled. Mark's stomach tightened. The smile didn't fit the face. It stretched wide, too wide, like his cheeks had to pull against something resisting beneath them. "I'll call somebody for you," Mark said, suddenly not wanting him anywhere near the truck. The man blinked slowly, then took a single step closer. Not fast, not aggressive, just close enough that Mark felt deeply, instinctively unsafe. He rolled the window up and eased the truck forward. The man didn't chase him, didn't shout, didn't move after that one step. He simply watched as the truck pulled away, his face fading out of the rearview mirror like something dissolving back into the night. Mark drove for 20 minutes before he let out the breath he'd been holding. His pulse slowly settled. Probably just a deranged drifter, he told himself. Maybe someone who'd wandered too long in the cold and lost his senses. It didn't matter, he was miles behind him now. But then he saw him again. Standing on the right side of the road, same posture, same pale face, not even breathing hard. Mark hit the brakes instinctively. The truck slid slightly on the old asphalt before stopping. "That's not possible," he whispered. There were no intersecting roads, no shortcuts, no cars, no way. This time the man lifted an arm slowly, pointing directly at Mark. Mark floored the gas. He didn't stop again, not even when he reached a service station 40 miles ahead. He pulled in fast, parked crookedly, and stumbled out of the truck, shaking. The station was old and small, run by a single elderly attendant who looked startled to see someone arrive so aggressively. "You all right, son?" the man asked. Mark rubbed his face, trying to think clearly. There was a guy on the road, pale, thin, wearing a white shirt. I passed him twice. No car, just appearing. The old man stared at him for a long moment, expression blank. Then he exhaled slowly, tiredly, like he'd heard this before. "You need coffee," he said quietly, "and we'll talk." Inside, the station smelled of burnt dust and old propane. The lights flickered. It felt like a forgotten relic of the 1970s. But it was warm, and the coffee burned Mark's throat enough to remind him he was still alive. The old attendant leaned on the counter, eyes narrowed behind thick glasses. "Did he look wrong?" Mark swallowed. "Yeah, how'd you know? Too tall? Skinny like he didn't have bones in the right places? Smile that didn't fit?" Mark nodded slowly, dread blooming. "Yes. And you saw him twice?" "Exactly." The old man stared at him with sad eyes. "Then you need to leave this place now." "Who was he?" The attendant looked toward the dark windows, almost like he expected to see the pale man standing there. "Nobody knows. Folks call him the Walker. Some say he's the spirit of a lost man who died out here. Others say he's something older, something that wanders the empty places looking for someone to notice him." "That's insane," Mark whispered. "Maybe," the old man said, "but over the years, truckers have sworn they saw him, and the ones who stopped, the ones who talked to him." He paused. "What?" "They disappear." Mark set the coffee cup down with trembling fingers. "I didn't talk to him. I just asked if he needed help." The attendant went pale. "Then he heard your voice." Before Mark could respond, the station lights flickered violently. The hum of the refrigerator died. The radio behind the counter cut out mid-song. Everything fell silent, except for the faint whisper of the wind through the cracked window. Mark felt the air change, the same suffocating pressure he'd felt on the road. "No," he whispered. The old man reached under the counter, pulled out a shotgun, and pumped it with shaking hands. "Get behind me." They heard it then, soft, deliberate footsteps on the concrete outside, slow, even, dragging lightly like something not used to walking. Tap, drag, tap, drag. The footsteps stopped directly outside the front door. The old man raised the gun. "If it comes inside, run. Don't look back." A shadow passed across the window, a long, distorted silhouette. Then a pale hand pressed against the glass, too long, fingers bending subtly even though they didn't move. The smile appeared next. Pressed against the glass, wide. Impossible. The old man fired. The window shattered. The blast echoed through the silent desert. But the moment the glass broke, the figure was gone, dissolved into the darkness like mist. The old man cursed under his breath, then pointed the gun at the door. "We leave. Now." They sprinted to Mark's truck. The engine roared to life on the first try, a miracle in itself. The old man climbed into the passenger seat, still clutching the shotgun. They sped back onto the highway. For 30 minutes, neither said a word. The darkness around them felt like something alive, pressing close. The old man kept glancing behind them every few seconds like he expected to see the pale figure racing after them. Just as Mark started to relax again, the old man whispered, "No, no, no, no." Mark looked in the rearview mirror. There he was, standing in the center of the road behind them, staring, smiling. And he wasn't shrinking with distance. In fact, with every blink, he seemed closer, like he was stepping toward them without moving. "We're not outrunning him," Mark said through clenched teeth. "You can't outrun something that isn't alive," the old man said. "What do we do?" The old man hesitated. "You can ignore him. You can pretend you never saw him. But once he smiles at you, once he hears you." Mark tightened his grip on the wheel. "Tell me how to stop this." "You can't." Then, without warning, something slammed into the side of the truck. Not a car, not an animal. Something heavy like a mass of air carrying weight. The truck swerved. Mark fought the wheel, skidding on loose gravel. Another hit, this time from the roof. The metal dented inward. Then another and another. Thumps from every direction, the roof bending like someone walking on it. The old man screamed, "Don't stop the truck!" Mark kept his foot on the gas. The walker's face appeared upside down in the windshield, like he was hanging there. His neck stretched, elongated, too long to be remotely human. His smile inches from the glass. Mark screamed and jerked the wheel. The truck veered, smashed through a fence, and tumbled down a shallow embankment. Everything went black. When Mark opened his eyes, the world was sideways. The truck had landed on its side. Pain radiated through his ribs, but he managed to move. The old man had been thrown partially through the windshield, his body twisted unnaturally, unmoving. "Sir?" Mark whispered. No response. A soft dragging sound approached. Tap, tap, drag. Mark's breath hitched. He crawled out through the broken window, blood dripping down his arms. He staggered away from the truck, stumbling onto the dirt. The footsteps grew louder. He didn't look back. He ran. The night stretched endlessly in every direction. No lights, no towns, no salvation, only darkness and the faint glow of stars overhead. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs trembled. But the footsteps never fell behind. They were always close, always steady. Eventually, he saw a shape on the horizon, an oil pump nodding slowly, silhouetted against the dark. He sprinted toward it. At least it was something, a landmark, a place where someone might be working. But when he reached it, the pump was silent, abandoned, just another piece of rust in the middle of nowhere. Mark collapsed to his knees. The night went quiet again. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, he thought maybe, just maybe, the walker had given up. Maybe he'd been spared. Then he heard breathing behind him, soft, cold, not human. Mark closed his eyes. He didn't scream. Nobody found the old man's body for 3 days. By then, coyotes had gotten to him. The truck was pulled from the embankment and inspected, but there was no sign of another person. They never found Mark. Some say he walked off into the desert in shock. Some say he succumbed to dehydration. Some say he vanished in the night, like so many others who drove that lonely road. But truckers still whisper about the walker, about the pale man in the white shirt, about the smile that stretches too far, about the figure that appears on the roadside where nobody should be, waiting, watching. And every now and then someone claims they've seen another man out there too, wandering aimlessly through the sagebrush. Not pale, not smiling, just walking and walking, eyes empty as if searching for a road home he'll never find. But if you ever drive that road at night and you see a man standing alone at the edge of the asphalt, don't stop. Don't slow down. Don't speak. And whatever you do, don't let him smile at you. Story the end. A cold rain hammered the windshield as I crossed the lonely stretch of highway cutting through central Idaho. I'd been driving since dawn, weaving through mountain roads and winding passes, and by late afternoon the clouds sank low enough to scrape the top of the world. I hadn't meant to be out here, somewhere between tiny logging towns and abandoned mining camps, but I'd taken a wrong turn after the gas station near Salmon. The GPS lost signal miles ago, but I kept going because the road, however narrow, seemed to continue forward. In my mind, it had to lead somewhere. When the rain thickened into sheets, I decided to pull off at the next turnout. I drove another 15 minutes before spotting a faded sign on the right, Cedar Hollow, 3 miles. The wood was cracked, paint peeling. It didn't look promising, but I didn't want to keep driving blind. My eyes were sore, hands stiff on the steering wheel. I turned onto the narrow road and immediately regretted it. Mud splashed against the undercarriage, potholes shook the whole frame of the car, and moss-covered trees leaned so close they brushed the sides. Branches hung low, slick with rain. The place looked swallowed by the forest. 3 miles felt like 10, but finally the trees thinned. Ahead, in the dimming daylight, a small clearing opened to a cluster of wooden cabins. At least 5, maybe 6, all arranged haphazardly around a muddy square. It looked like an abandoned camp from the 1950s. No cars. No signs of life. Just silence. But on the far side of the clearing, one cabin had a light glowing in the window, faint but definitely lit. Smoke rose from a chimney. Relief washed over me. At least someone was here. I parked near the largest cabin and stepped out, umbrella trembling in my hands. It was colder here than on the road, an unnatural chill beneath the rain. My boots sank deep into mud as I walked toward the lit cabin. The door creaked open before I even reached the steps. A man stood in the doorway, late 60s, clean-shaven, gray hair combed neatly to one side. He wore an old flannel shirt and a look I couldn't place. Not welcome, not unwelcome. Simply aware. "You're lost," he said matter-of-factly. "I took the wrong road," I admitted. "Didn't expect the weather to hit like this. Is there any place around here I can stay? Just for the night?" He regarded me for an uncomfortably long moment, then stepped aside. "You'd better come in." I hesitated, but rain was pouring harder, running off the roof in torrents. I stepped inside. The cabin was old. Wooden walls, stone fireplace, shelves of dusty books, a table with a lantern burning low. A pot simmered on the stove. It smelled like stew. The man closed the door behind me. "Name's Carson." I introduced myself, set my bag down, and rubbed my hands together. "You're lucky you turned in here," he said. "Storm's going to get worse tonight. We had one like this last year, flooded half the back roads." "I appreciate you letting me in," I said. "Is this a town or—" "Was," he said shortly. "Old logging settlement, closed up years ago. I still keep the place up." I assumed he was a caretaker or landowner. He gestured toward the table. "You look half frozen. Sit. You need food?" My stomach growled. I nodded. He ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of me. I ate quietly while he poked the fire. At first, everything seemed normal, just a strange old man living out here alone. But then he asked, "You saw anything on the road?" I paused mid-spoonful. "Like what?" He stared into the fire. "People," he said slowly. "Shapes, moving where they shouldn't." A chill crawled up my neck. "No," I said carefully. "Just the trees." He nodded without looking at me. "Good." He said it like he meant the opposite. When I finished eating, he showed me to a spare room, small, Spartan, with a thin mattress and a single oil lamp. I thanked him again. "If you hear anything," Carson said, hands still on the doorknob, "stay in this room. Don't come out, no matter what." That made me pause. "What do you mean?" His face tightened slightly. "Just stay inside for your own sake." Before I could ask more, he closed the door. I lay on the bed fully clothed. Outside, the wind rattled the old wooden boards. Rain hammered the roof. The room felt colder than it should, even with the lamp burning. Within an hour, exhaustion crept in. I must have dozed off. Sometime in the night, I woke to a sound, soft, faint, like someone dragging fabric across the floorboards. I lifted my head. There it was again. Scrape, scrape, scrape. But it wasn't inside the room. It was in the hallway. I sat up slowly, heart thudding. Carson had said not to open the door, but the noise grew louder, closer. Then, a whisper, a woman's voice, very soft. "Help." I froze. Another whisper from farther down the hall. Please, someone. My chest tightened. They sounded desperate. I stood, gripping the cold doorknob, ready to open it, but then both voices stopped. Completely. A second later, the floorboards outside my door creaked, long and slow, as though something very tall leaned its weight down. I stepped back from the door. A low scraping sound, almost like fingernails, traced across the wood outside. I covered my mouth to keep from breathing too loudly. Then I heard something that turned my stomach. A slow inhale, right outside the door, as if something was smelling for me. I stayed frozen until the noise drifted away down the hall, then out of earshot. It took an hour, maybe more, before exhaustion overcame fear. I slept sitting up against the far wall. When morning came, sunlight cut through the cracks in the doorframe. I felt stiff, cold. I pushed the door open. The hallway was empty. I found Carson in the main room, drinking coffee. He looked like he hadn't slept. You heard them, he said flatly, not a question. Who? I demanded. What the hell was that? He stared out the window toward the wet trees. They come during storms, he said quietly. Always have. You're lucky they didn't figure out the door latch. My skin crawled. What are they? He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to one of the distant cabins. You should see something. Against my better judgment, I followed him outside. The rain had slowed to a mist. He led me to a cabin smaller than his and pushed the door open. Inside was a room clearly designed as a dormitory. 6 bunks, rotting mattresses, broken windows. But what drew my attention were the claw marks. Deep gouges carved into the wooden walls, long and hooked, some reaching nearly to the ceiling. Carson pointed to the floor. I looked. A set of footprints, bare, human-shaped but elongated, trailed across the dust. Each print at least 16 inches long, the toes pointed unnaturally forward. They aren't animals, Carson said quietly. They walk upright, and they mimic. Mimic? I repeated. He nodded. Voices, people they hear, people they find. My blood ran cold, he continued. Cedar Hollow used to have 40 residents, men, women, children. They all vanished over one winter. The search party found these marks. And bones. I swallowed hard. Why are you still here? He sighed. I was 19 when it happened. My family was out hunting that night. We weren't in the hollow when they came. By the time we got back, everyone was gone. I spent years trying to make sense of it. He looked around the abandoned camp. Now I keep watch. Warn off strangers. Try to keep people alive. I was silent. Carson studied me. You need to leave today, before nightfall. I agreed instantly, but as I walked back toward my car, I noticed something wrong. My tires were slashed, not cut cleanly, but shredded, long, ragged tears across the rubber as though something with hooked fingers had raked across them. I ran back to the cabin. They did this, I said. They were right outside. Carson closed his eyes slowly. They want you to stay. Then drive me out, I insisted. We need to go now. He shook his head. My truck won't make it. Mudslides wiped out the back road last month. Only way out is the main road, and they wait near it during storms. I felt panic rising. So what? I'm trapped here overnight again? He gave me a long, haunted look. You're not the first. I didn't sleep at all that night. Carson sat by the fire, shotgun across his lap, watching the door. I stayed near the window, lamp turned low. For hours, wind tore at the cabin. Rain slammed the roof. Then, around 2 a.m, the noises began. First, a distant wail, high and thin, like a woman screaming into the storm, but stretched too long, like a sound forced through something that didn't breathe right. Carson stiffened, raising the shotgun. Another scream followed. Closer this time. Then another. Deep enough to sound like a man's voice. Then a child's, all overlapping. But the tones were wrong, distorted, broken, cracking in mid-pitch, as if something was trying voices on for size. The storm grew louder, and suddenly something struck the wall, hard. Then again, and again. Something was circling the cabin, hitting it rhythmically, testing it. The windows shook, the roof creaked. Carson whispered, "Don't look outside." Then the whispers began. Dozens of them. Some whispered my name, my actual name. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voices seemed to crawl inside my skull. Around 4 a.m, everything stopped. Dead silence. No rain, no wind. No whispers. Even Carson froze. This is worse, he said. A second later, every window in the cabin rattled violently. Then something pressed sharply against the front door, wood bending inward, cracking near the hinges. Carson fired a shot. The cabin fell silent again. For a moment, I thought that was the end of it, but then something slammed the door so hard it splintered. I saw a grotesque shape in the gap, elongated fingers curling through the crack, pale and wet. A single amber eye peered inside, set too far to the side of a face. Carson yelled for me to run. I bolted out the back door into freezing mud. Something shrieked behind us, so loud my ears rang. I followed Carson toward the tree line, but he grabbed my arm, pulling me behind one of the abandoned cabins. "They see movement," he whispered. "Stay still." I pressed against the cabin wall, breathing shallowly. Shapes moved between trees, tall, skeletal forms weaving through the fog. One stopped feet from our hiding spot. I could hear its breathing, wet, rattling. It stood there for what felt like 10 minutes. Rain dripped from its long fingers. And then, slowly, it moved on. At dawn, the storm finally broke. Mist rose from the soaked ground. The shapes vanished. Carson and I crept back to his cabin. The front door hung half off its hinges. Claw marks covered it. He looked exhausted. "You need to go," he said. "Now, before they come back." He walked me to the road beyond the hollow. 5 miles of thick forest. But in daylight, the creatures seemed to retreat deep into the woods. Carson pointed. "Follow the incline. Don't stop. Don't look back. The main road is south." I turned to thank him, but he was already walking back toward the ruined cabin. "Will you be okay?" I called after him. He didn't answer. I walked. After 20 minutes, I heard distant cracking branches behind me. I didn't turn around. After an hour, I reached the road. Another hour later, I flagged down a passing trucker. He took me to the nearest town. When I told the sheriff what happened, he gave me a long stare and said, "Cedar Hollow doesn't exist anymore." I insisted it did. I had been there. I'd seen it. He shook his head. "That place burned down in the 1980s. Nothing left but foundations and ash." When I described Carson, the sheriff frowned. "That name sounded familiar. There was a Carson family. They lived there when the settlement disappeared. Last survivor went missing over 30 years ago." He looked me up and down. "Storm must have shaken you. Folks get turned around in the woods." I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd seen. They hadn't imagined the claw marks. They hadn't imagined the whispers. And when I got my car towed back from the area, the mechanic checked the tires. "You didn't hit anything," he said. "Whatever tore these wasn't metal." Sometimes, late at night, I hear echoes of those voices in my dreams. Sometimes I wake convinced something is standing just outside my bedroom window. I avoid long drives through forests now, avoid storms, avoid towns not marked clearly on maps. And every so often I check satellite images of Idaho, zooming in on the trees, looking for the faint shape of a cabin roof. I never find it. But once, when the image refreshed, I saw something else. A tall shadow between the trees, just at the edge of the hollow. Leaning, watching, waiting. Story the end. The highway seemed endless, stretching straight through the flat plains of Kansas, with nothing but cornfields and the occasional abandoned farm. Jenna had convinced herself it would be a fun weekend getaway. Just her and 2 friends, Matt and Corey, driving out to a supposedly haunted cabin she had read about online. The GPS warned of rough roads ahead, but Matt insisted they could handle it. A little dirt track never hurt anyone. By the time they left the paved road, the sun was already sinking below the horizon. The sky was painted in bruised purples and oranges, and the corn swayed like waves in the wind. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and rot. The cabin was nowhere in sight, and the narrow path was riddled with potholes and overgrown weeds. They joked at first, teasing about getting lost, but the laughter faded as the light dimmed and the wind picked up. When they finally spotted the cabin, it looked like it had been pulled straight out of a horror movie. The paint was long gone, the roof sagged under years of neglect, and the windows were either boarded up or shattered. A chill ran down Jenna's spine. I don't know if this is a good idea," she whispered, but Matt waved her off. "Come on, it'll be fun. What's the worst that could happen?" Inside, the air was thick and musty. The wooden floorboards groaned under their weight. A fireplace sat cold and empty in the corner, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling like tattered curtains. They set up their sleeping bags, lit a few candles, and tried to make the place feel a little more welcoming. As night fell, strange noises began to echo through the cabin. Soft taps, thuds from above like someone walking on the roof. Jenna tried to brush it off as the house settling, but Corey wasn't convinced. "I don't like this," he muttered. peering nervously at the ceiling. Matt laughed, but even he seemed a little uneasy. Hours later, while the other two slept, Jenna woke to a scraping sound coming from the hallway. She froze, straining to hear. The sound was deliberate, slow, dragging across the floorboards. She grabbed her phone for light and crept toward the door. Nothing. The hallway was empty. She was about to return to her sleeping bag when a whisper floated from the corner of the room, so soft she almost thought she imagined it. "Leave," it said. Her heart raced, and she bolted back to her bag, shaking Matt awake. "Did you hear that?" she hissed. Matt, still half asleep, mumbled something about the wind. Corey, however, was awake now, eyes wide. "It's not the wind," he said, voice trembling. "I saw someone outside by the tree line." They tried to rationalize it. Maybe a deer, maybe a prankster, maybe their imaginations running wild. But then came the knocks on the windows, slow and methodical. And the shadows, they moved unnaturally across the walls as if the moonlight itself was alive. They huddled together, waiting for dawn. When morning came, the cab seemed quieter, almost too quiet. Jenna suggested they leave immediately, but Matt insisted they explore first. They wandered through the overgrown yard, discovering a small, rusted shed behind the cabin. Inside were old furniture, broken toys, and walls scratched with deep marks, claw-like gouges that made their stomachs churn. But the worst was the drawings on the walls, crude sketches of people with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. At the center of each drawing was a small, familiar figure, each one labeled with a name they recognized, their names, written by someone else. Panic set in. They ran back to the cabin, packing frantically. The moment they opened the door, a cold gust of air slammed it shut behind them, and the whispers returned, louder now, surrounding them. "You can't leave," the voices hissed. Shadows coiled in the corners of their vision, and when they turned, figures, tall, thin, impossibly dark, stood watching, unmoving. They scrambled to the car, but the engine wouldn't start. Jenna tried her phone, but there was no signal. They were trapped. The figures moved closer, gliding over the ground with an unnatural silence. Jenna screamed, pounding on the horn, but it seemed only to amuse the shadows. Finally, after what felt like hours, the engine sputtered to life. They didn't look back, tires kicking up dust as they tore down the dirt road. Only when they reached the highway did the figures disappear, or so they thought. Weeks later, Jenna still couldn't shake the memories. Sometimes, in quiet moments, she could hear whispers in the wind, calling her name. Corey moved away entirely, refusing to talk about it. Matt was obsessed with returning, insisting it was just a weird coincidence, though Jenna knew better. And then she received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single photograph, taken from inside the cabin just after they had left. In the corner, a figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile watched from the window. The photo was taken by someone or something still waiting. Story: the end. The wind howled across the flat expanse of Kansas plains, rattling the old farmhouse's windows like a warning. The isolation was palpable. You could drive for miles without seeing another house, a gas station, or even a single car. It was the kind of place where silence weighed on you, where the sun seemed to cast longer shadows than usual. For Jack and his younger sister Emily, it had always been home. Their parents had moved out here when Jack was 12 on this seeking the peace of the country, a life away from the noise of city chaos. Peace, yes, but with a price. Sometimes you paid in paranoia, sometimes in fear. It was late October when the first strange thing happened. Jack had been driving into town for groceries, an hour each way, and he noticed it on the road just outside the farm. A black truck, old, beat up, rusting in places, sitting by the tree line that bordered their property. At first, he thought it belonged to a hunter or some local passing through, but the vehicle hadn't moved. It had been there for hours, engine off, as if it were waiting. When he got home, Emily was standing at the window, eyes wide. "Jack," she whispered, "that truck, it's been there. I can see it from the porch." Her voice trembled, and he realized he hadn't mentioned it because he thought she was imagining things. He stepped outside, scanning the horizon. The truck was indeed there, dark and silent. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural. Hunters usually had camouflage gear, deer in the back, or at least a shotgun resting on the seat. This had none of that. Only the stillness, and the way the tires were angled slightly toward the farmhouse like it had been waiting. They tried to brush it off. Probably someone lost, Jack said, though his voice lacked conviction. By the next day, the truck hadn't moved. He drove into town, thinking maybe he'd catch the driver, ask if they needed directions. The gas station attendant, a man named Carl, didn't know anything about a stranded vehicle, and no one had seen anyone around. Then came the knocks. At first it was subtle, a faint tapping on the back door. Emily was the first to notice it. "Jack, someone's at the door," she said, clutching the edge of the kitchen counter. He opened it. Nothing. Just the autumn wind, scattering dead leaves across the porch. But the feeling of being watched grew. By nightfall, the knocking became more deliberate. Someone or something was walking around outside. Heavy footsteps, dragging, stopping just out of sight. Jack and Emily slept fitfully, doors locked, windows shut tight. Their dog, a black lab named Hunter, growled incessantly, hair bristling. A week passed, and the truck never left. Jack tried to confront it, but every time he approached, the cab was empty. No driver, no footprints leading to or from the vehicle. He took to keeping a baseball bat by the door, sleeping in clothes, always listening. Emily barely left the house except for the occasional school bus ride. The terror was a constant shadow, a pressure in the air. One night around midnight, the power went out. Not unusual for a rural area, but the timing was strange. Jack lit a few candles and checked the breaker box. Nothing seemed damaged. As he was about to return to the living room, Emily screamed. He ran toward her bedroom, tripping over the dog, who was growling at the doorway. The window was open, despite being locked. A muddy footprint had smeared across the sill. He grabbed the bat, heart racing, and peered outside. The truck was gone. Relief was brief. From the woods to the east, a figure emerged. Tall, hunched, dressed in black. The person didn't run. They walked slowly, deliberately, stopping at the tree line, staring. Jack could feel their gaze pierce the darkness. He shouted, swinging the bat, and the figure disappeared into the night. Police were called. Sheriff Collins, a lanky man who knew every back road and bar in the county, arrived the next morning. "No one's been reported missing around here," he said, scratching his head. "You got anything else for me?" Jack showed him the muddy footprint, but the sheriff frowned. "Looks like a deer or maybe one of the local kids playing pranks. Nothing we can pin on anyone." But Jack knew it wasn't a prank. Emily knew it wasn't a prank. And then the letters started. They arrived by mail, plain envelopes, no return address, the handwriting jagged and uneven. Each one contained a single sentence, "I'm watching." Days later, "You can't hide." The letters were never postmarked, never caught in the mailbox camera in town. It was as if someone was already inside their world, closer than the mailman could be. Sleep became impossible. Jack started keeping a gun in the kitchen, though he hated it, and Emily rarely spoke, only nodding when he asked if she saw anything outside. But sightings increased. Shadowy figures near the cornfield, someone standing just beyond the barn, never moving, always observing. Hunter refused to go out alone, shaking as if he sensed something wrong. Then came the phone calls, static at first, whispers, heavy breathing, nothing intelligible. Jack tried tracing them, no number, no signal. Every night, the whispers grew louder, more persistent, sometimes calling Emily's name. One night, desperate for answers, Jack set up cameras around the house. Motion sensors, night vision cams, everything he could afford on short notice. That night, everything went quiet. Too quiet. The next morning, Jack went to check the footage. His stomach dropped. The cameras showed the truck again, parked near the tree line, exactly where it had been weeks ago. Only this time, the cab wasn't empty. A man, or something, sat inside, head turned toward the camera. Face obscured by shadows, but the posture was unnatural. Too still. Then the footage flickered, and the next frame showed the inside of their kitchen. The camera had captured someone, or something, standing by Emily's bedroom door while they slept. The figure didn't move, just stared. Jack called Sheriff Collins again, more frantic this time. "You've got to come. There's someone here, inside the house." Collins arrived within an hour, gun drawn, flashlight cutting through the dark. They searched the house, every corner, every closet, under the beds. Nothing. No one. "Jack, you've got to calm down," the sheriff said, though his voice lacked conviction. He left that night, but the unease lingered. A week later, Emily disappeared. Jack came home from a rare trip to town. He parked the truck, called for her. No response. Her room was empty, bed unmade, window open. Footprints in the mud outside leading toward the cornfield. They weren't hunters. They weren't normal. They were human, but stretched, elongated, almost unnatural in stride. Jack ran after them, flashlight sweeping through the rows. The cornstalks towered, shadows shifting in ways that made his stomach twist. The footprints ended abruptly in the middle of the field. He called Emily's name until his voice cracked, until the night swallowed it. She was gone. The search lasted days. Volunteers from neighboring towns combed the fields, drones flew above, helicopters circled. Nothing. No sign. Not a trace of Emily, not even her backpack or shoes. The sheriff's department reluctantly called off the search after 3 weeks. She probably wandered off, they said. It happens. Jack didn't accept it. He stayed in the house, guarding every window, every door, recording every sound, and the truck, it returned. Every night, sitting silently at the edge of the tree line. The letters came too, handwritten again. She's with me now. Months passed. Jack became a ghost in his own home. He barely ate, slept, or spoke to anyone. Neighbors stopped stopping by. Mail was collected but never opened. Hunter died one cold morning. Heart stopped suddenly, as leaving Jack entirely alone. One night he awoke to the sound of soft humming, a lullaby Emily used to sing. It was coming from the cornfield. Jack grabbed his gun, ran outside. The moon was a sliver in the sky, barely lighting the rows of corn. The humming grew louder. He ran, waving his flashlight, calling her name. And then he saw her. Emily, standing at the edge of the field, but not as he remembered her. Her eyes were dark, hollow, her movements jerky, unnatural. She turned her head slowly toward him, mouth opening, not to speak, but to smile. Before he could react, the black truck's engine roared behind him. Headlights cut through the darkness. The figure in the driver's seat leaned out, long arms, fingers like claws, and Jack felt something cold, suffocating, fill the air. He fired the gun, but the shot sounded hollow, echoing as if in a cave. When he awoke, he was in the truck. Emily sat beside him, silent, her eyes empty. The world outside the windows had changed, trees twisted into impossible shapes, sky a sickly green. The radio crackled, and the voice came, low and guttural. Welcome to your new home. Jack never returned. People in the nearest town eventually forgot about the farm. Occasionally, someone driving late would see a truck parked at the edge of the cornfield, engine off, waiting. Sometimes a faint lullaby drifted through the air, and the locals would speed up, refusing to look back. Years later, the farmhouse still stands, though empty. Travelers say they've seen a figure in the window, watching. And on certain nights, if the wind is right, you can hear the soft tapping at the door, the whispers calling your name, and the faint humming of a child's lullaby drifting across the fields. Story, the end. The first time I saw the sign, it was battered and small, half knocked down by rust and overgrowth. Welcome to Coulter's Fork, it read, although the paint had faded until the words were barely legible. I was hurtling down the rural two-lane road in northern Minnesota on my way to a hunting trip with my friend Jesse. It was late November. The trees were barren, the ground stained with early snow and ice, the wind sharp and sleeting, and the isolation, for someone from the suburbs like me, already felt potent. There wasn't a service station for miles, no convenience store with hot coffee and donuts, nothing but narrow lanes, dense woods, and the intermittent evidence of abandoned cabins or old barns crumpling into themselves. We had arrived mid-afternoon, hauling our gear, rifles, sleeping bags, extra jackets, snow boots, food, everything you'd bring for a weekend of rugged solitude. Jesse had grown up in Wisconsin and claimed to be comfortable off the grid. I'd done a fair share of camping, but never this remote. Our plan was simple. Pick a clearing in the Maples Woods, set up camp, hunt some deer, drink whiskey by the fire, and sleep under the stars. Probably naive romanticism, but I was game. The drive-in had been quiet until the road narrowed and the GPS flickered out, showing no signal, then finally suggested we were off-road. That's when the real feeling set in. No other cars, no lights beyond our headlights, nothing but inky darkness pressing beyond the glass. We parked at what looked like a rest stop, a gravel turnout with no sign of life, and hoisted our backpacks and rifles. I closed the car door and the wind roared. The forest seemed to inhale, exhale, a living thing. We set out on foot. Our boots crunched on ice-flecked dead leaves. Our breath came in clouds. We chose a clearing visible from a ridge that promised some vantage, a broad opening in the trees with a little trickle of a stream at one side. The plan: set camp facing the ridge so we could watch for deer and maybe pick up on movement. At first, everything went smoothly. Tent, fire, dinner, beans, sausage, freeze-dried whatever, and whiskey sipped as the sun dropped. We laughed and talked about life back home, about relationships, about jobs, the crackle of the fire, the smell of pine and cold air. Perfect. But then, after the flames died down and the firelight retreated into embers, I heard the first sound from somewhere deeper in the woods. At first, I thought it was the wind catching against a branch. Then I heard it again, a low, guttural moan, a long-drawn ooh-ah. The kind of sound I've heard maybe once in nightmares, never in real life. Jesse stopped mid-sip. We both looked toward the dark where trees stood like silent watchers. I shook my head. Probably an elk or something, I said. Jesse agreed, but I wasn't convinced. We finished our whiskey and crawled into our sleeping bags in the tent. The night was cold. Every breath seemed to freeze on contact with the dark. I lay listening, the stream whispering, the wind flicking branches, my heartbeat loud in the stillness. Then the moan again, longer this time, closer. I sat up. "Jesse," I whispered. "Do you hear that?" He nodded, voice low. "Yeah, maybe someone out there." I felt a wave of dread. Someone out there, alone, watching. We cracked the tent flap open enough to peer out. Darkness lay beyond, thick and silent. No lights, no signs of human presence. We stayed inside until dawn, no more sounds, but also no relief. In the morning, we decided strongly to pack up early. We still wanted deer, but something had shifted. We never discussed it, but I think we both felt the same thing: vulnerability. We moved camp deeper into the trees, still near the clearing, but more hidden. By midday, we had a deer, easy enough, and we celebrated quietly. But as afternoon faded, the mood darkened. While Jesse was retrieving the deer we had shot, he had gone a little up the ridge. I stayed at the tent reading the map. The woods were silent, too silent. Then I noticed footprints. Not huge like a bear, but human-sized, muddy, heading toward the tent from the woods. My heart froze. I called Jesse. He returned quickly. I showed him. "See these footprints?" He crouched beside me. "That's not ours," he muttered. I swallowed hard. "What do you think it means?" I asked quietly. He shrugged. "Someone else here. Could be hunters. But who leaves tracks toward campsite? Unless..." The afternoon sun filtered through the pines, but we felt the weight of unseen eyes. We broke camp early and decided to hike out toward our car, pack the deer, and leave before nightfall. The forest seemed to conspire. The trail was harder to find, the signposts non-existent. My phone still no signal. We were alone, and someone else had been here. As the sun dropped, darkness accrued in patches. We came to a narrow ravine where the stream had cut a deep trough. As we crossed the little log bridge, I slipped slightly, and as I stood back up, the forest seemed to shift. A figure farthest edge of my peripheral vision, between two trees. Someone crouched, or a deer. I stopped, raised my rifle out of fear. Jesse heard the clicking of the safety and turned. "What is it?" he whispered. I didn't know. I strained my eyes. The light was dimming. It vanished. We hurried. I kept glancing over my shoulder. When we came back to the road and saw our car, relief washed through me. Yet as I reached inside for the keys, I noticed a spray of red paint across the windshield. "Run" in big jagged letters. My blood ran cold. Jesse turned, pale. I didn't. When I was gone, I swear I didn't see that. We shared a look. We were being toyed with. We got in the car. We were going to leave immediately, but the key wouldn't turn in the ignition. It glitched, then died. The lights flickered. Engine. Silence. We looked at each other, darkness all around. Then, a sound. Heavy footsteps, crunching in the gravel, coming from the road we had driven in. We stared out the windshield. Nothing clear, but we saw a shape emerging. Tall, hunched slightly, moving in slow, unnatural gait. It didn't respond to our lights. It seemed to glide. We unlocked doors, kept our rifles ready. The figure paused at the tree line, then stepped into the beam of the headlights. A man? No. His face was dark, like burnt charcoal. Eyes deep hollows, reflecting a pale amber glint. The clothes were ragged, soaked in dirt and something else. He held a long branch, roughly sharpened at the end. We backed the car slowly, every instinct screaming. The engine flashed to life. Jesse had spun the key with a practiced jerk, and we lurched forward, tires gravel flying. The figure stood, watching as we left the turnout and sped along the road into the darkness. The sign, "Welcome to Coulter's Fork," glowed briefly in our headlights, and then we were gone. Back in town, we stopped at a little diner. Through the fogged window, we saw police cars, but no police came to talk to us. Let us drive away. At home, I told my girlfriend. She pressed me. Why didn't you call the sheriff? We had no service. And by the time we drove to a zone where the signal came, the landmarks were gone. We tried finding Coulter's Fork on the map. Nothing. No sign of a town, no community. Just forest and emptiness. Weeks later, I did some digging, found a forum post from someone who'd stayed in an old hunting cabin near some place called Coldwater Fork, 60 miles north of my drive. They told a similar story. Footprints. A moaning at night, a figure by the road, painted warnings. They wrote it off as a prank or an old local myth. Another post said in the 1970s a mining camp had disappeared, leaving no records, and some say the ghost of a trapper roams the forest, twisted by cold, rage, and hunger. One night I had nightmares of that man, his pale amber gaze, that branch pointed like a spear. I wondered, who was he? Why did he do this? Was this local craziness, some isolated lunatic, or something worse and older? Months later, I got a call from Jesse. He sounded edgy. I haven't told you yet, he said, but I got a snapshot on my phone. He sent it. It was taken at the edge of our campsite just before I noticed the footprints. There, in the dim, late afternoon light, behind trees, stood a figure, tall, lean, staring. The camera failed to catch his face clearly. It was motion blurred, eyes glowing amber. And in the background, partially hidden, I saw our car's windshield and the reflection of red letters in the glass. Run. I froze. He said, we should have left then. It's not a joke. Since then, I avoid remote forest hunts. I rarely speak of it. But every time I hear wind through pines, I think of that place. Silent, wild, empty, but watched. I wonder how many travelers enter those isolated roads thinking adventure, thrill, and never see the message. They never leave. They vanish. And maybe someone paints run across a windshield and they just drive off, shrug it off, never understand the warning. One day I'd like to go back, only to know. But a conditional one. Never alone, always daylight, bring satellite phone. I don't want to meet that figure again. I don't want to hear the moan. I don't want to see the amber eyes reflecting in the darkness. Because I've learned, some places on Earth are not maps. They resist being understood. They are beyond frontiers, beyond towns, and they watch. They mark you. Story the end. The first time I realized something was terribly wrong, it was already too late to turn back. I was living in a tiny town in northern Wisconsin, in a place so remote that the GPS would often just give up halfway through the forest. My job had brought me there, a surveyor for a utility company, mapping out lines for a new cell tower. But what I found was nothing like the brochures or the charming small town life promised. It was mid-October when I arrived. The leaves had turned a shade of fire orange and blood red, and the wind carried a chill that cut through my coat like knives. My cabin wasn't much, a small single-room structure built in the 1960s, tucked near the edge of a lake, surrounded by dense pines. The owner, an older man named Frank, gave me a key and told me not to wander too far. I didn't think much of it at first. Warnings like that seemed typical for anyone who grew up surrounded by forests. But that night, after I unpacked and had dinner, I realized there was a silence unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of quiet where every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made you jump. I kept hearing faint noises outside, footsteps, I thought at first. But when I looked, nothing was there. The lake reflected the moon perfectly, like a sheet of glass, and yet in the reflections of the trees, I sometimes thought I saw movement that wasn't my own. I chalked it up to nerves. I was alone, after all, in the middle of nowhere. The next morning, I drove into town to pick up supplies. The town was smaller than I expected. One gas station, a diner, and a general store. Everyone I met was friendly, but there was a peculiar undercurrent in their conversations. People would glance at me with a mix of curiosity and wariness, as if I were an outsider trespassing on something sacred. The diner was full of locals who all seemed to know each other, exchanging quiet nods and murmurs that made me feel invisible, but also watched. I returned to the cabin that afternoon, carrying enough groceries to last a week. As I unpacked, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the mud near the edge of the forest. I live alone in this cabin, I thought, and I haven't walked near that area yet. The prints were small, barefoot, and fresh. I froze, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. My rational mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe a deer, maybe some kids from the town, but the prints were distinctly human. That night, the noises returned, louder this time. Someone, or something, was circling the cabin. I could hear heavy breathing and the crunch of boots in the dried leaves. My phone had no signal, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I locked the doors and windows and tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably a hunter or some other local wandering the woods. But then I saw it. A shadow, tall and gaunt, standing just beyond the tree line. I swear it didn't move like a person. It was still for hours, just watching. The next morning, I packed up to leave. I couldn't stay another night not knowing what was out there. But when I got to my truck, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. It was written in smudged, jagged letters. You shouldn't have seen that. My stomach dropped. I checked my truck, my gear. Nothing was missing. I didn't wait to think. I drove off as fast as I could, but as I left the property, I noticed something on the edge of the forest. Footprints. Countless footprints, heading in my direction and then stopping abruptly at the tree line as if whatever had made them was waiting. I thought leaving would end it. I was wrong. The following week, I stayed at a motel in the nearest town that actually had cell service. Every day I would see glimpses of movement in the forest behind the building. A figure standing among the trees, watching. At first, I thought it was paranoia. But then the people in town began acting strange. They didn't speak to me. They avoided eye contact entirely. And then I noticed something even more disturbing. Every time I turned to look out a window, I would see that same figure in the distance, always at the edge of the woods, always watching. I tried calling the police. They didn't come. When I explained what I had seen, the dispatcher asked which town I was in and sighed, saying something like, "You're better off leaving for a while." I pressed for details. There's been trouble, people disappearing, folks from your town, your cabin area. I asked how long this had been happening. They hesitated. Years. I spent the night in that motel, barely sleeping, my paranoia keeping me awake. That's when I realized the figure wasn't alone. There were others. Small shapes moving between the trees, keeping to the shadows, but always converging toward me. I felt like prey. My rational mind screamed that I was imagining things, but my instincts, that deep, primal part of the brain, told me otherwise. I didn't want to stay another minute. I decided to return to the cabin, but this time with a plan. Document what was happening. Prove I wasn't crazy. I packed a camera, a flashlight, and a backpack with essentials. I wanted evidence, not to stay, but I had to see for myself. When I arrived, the cabin looked untouched, eerily so. The footprints from before were gone, the mud dried as if no one had passed through. But the forest felt alive. It was a sensation I can't describe, like eyes were everywhere, watching my every move. I set up cameras around the cabin just to see if anything would appear while I stayed in the daytime. Nothing happened during the day. But at night, the cameras captured shapes, thin and tall, slipping between trees, pausing, always watching. I stayed 2 nights, documenting as much as I could. Each time I tried to approach the figures, they disappeared into the forest, leaving only broken branches and the faint smell of smoke. By the 3rd night, I couldn't sleep at all. I heard whispers, not words, but sounds coming from every direction. Then I heard footsteps outside, circling the cabin again. I froze. I didn't breathe. I knew they were outside, right by the windows. And then I saw it through the crack in the curtain. A face, pale, elongated, like a stretched mask. No eyes I could see, but I could feel its gaze burning through me. Its mouth twisted into a smile that wasn't human. I stumbled backward, falling over the chair, and it was gone. I left the cabin that night. I never returned. I tried telling people, friends, family, anyone who would listen. Most laughed it off, thinking I was exhausted, stressed, or hallucinating. But the strangest thing happened. Every time I think about going back, or even about those woods, I feel watched. Not just a fleeting glance, like something inside the room with me. And I've moved across 3 states now. Doesn't matter. I still feel it. Watching. Waiting. Months later, I found a local news article buried in a small paper online. The headline read, "Missing hikers discovered decades later in northern Wisconsin, bodies unrecognizable." The description was vague, but the location matched exactly where my cabin had been. The authorities reported unusual circumstances and evidence of foul play by unknown entities. They never elaborated. I realized then that whatever was in those woods had been hunting for years, targeting anyone who wandered too close. I've never spoken to Frank again, the man who owned the cabin. I tried calling, number disconnected. I've tried finding anyone from that town, but it's like they vanished. I now live in a city, surrounded by people, lights, noise. Yet, every time the wind rustles the trees outside my apartment, I feel the same chill. Every time I see a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I see that elongated face. People ask me why I didn't report it more formally, why I didn't try to fight back. I couldn't. Whatever they aren't human. And I've learned that the moment you acknowledge them, the moment you let them know you see them, they begin watching you more closely. Last week, I found another note slipped under my apartment door. It wasn't written, it was scratched into the paper like claws had dragged a knife across it. 2 words, still here. I can't move. I can't sleep. I can't ignore it. The longer I stay, the closer they get. I know I'm being hunted. Every night, I see shadows stretching along my walls. Every morning, I wake to something unseen breathing in the corners of my apartment. I thought moving away would save me. I was wrong. I keep the lights on constantly now. I carry pepper spray, a baseball bat, sometimes even a knife. Doesn't matter. They don't need doors to enter. They don't need windows. They're always there, at the edge of vision, waiting. They've been waiting for decades, and now I'm part of it. Sometimes I think about going back to that cabin, back to that forest. Maybe if I confront them, I could end this. But I know the truth. There's no ending. They are patient, immortal somehow, and I am their prey, no matter where I go. I hear the whispers again, even now as I type this. I can feel it in the walls. I can feel it in the shadows that stretch longer than they should. I can hear the crunch of leaves in the distance, outside in the middle of nowhere, and I know they are closer than ever. I've tried to leave this story behind, tried to forget, but you can't forget what hunts you. You can't escape it. The woods will always be there, and when you wander, when you are alone, and when no one is watching, you may see it too. The waiting, the eyes, the shadow that isn't quite human, but isn't quite anything else. And then, like me, you'll understand what it truly means to be in the middle of nowhere. Story the end.